The storm didn't kill Lillian Caldwell that night, but her husband's indifference almost did. While Ethan sat warm in his study, tallying profits and losses like a man counting stones, his wife lay collapsed in 3 feet of snow, her fingers blue around the reins of an empty supply wagon. She'd gone where he refused to, into the heart of the territory's worst winter in decades, carrying food to families he'd written off as acceptable losses. When they found her, barely breathing, something cracked in the frozen wasteland of Ethan Caldwell's chest. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. If you want to see how a marriage built on ice became the warmth that saved an entire frontier, stay until the end. Drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from, and hit that like button. This is a story about power, survival, and the kind of love you have to fight for. The first mistake people made about Ethan Caldwell was thinking he was cruel. He wasn't cruel. Cruel required emotion, and Ethan had engineered emotion out of his life the same way he'd engineered irrigation systems across 12,000 acres of unforgiving land. Cruelty was inefficient. What he practiced was something colder, cleaner, absolute pragmatism. At 34, he owned more of the Greystone territory than any man alive, and he'd done it without inheritance, without luck, without the kind of reckless passion that got frontier men killed. While others gambled on gold strikes and cattle drives, Ethan built infrastructure, wells, grain storage, a network of roads that turned isolated homesteads into a functioning economy. He didn't win hearts. He didn't need to. He won results. The territory respected him the way you respect winter. Inevitable, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to your feelings about it. So when Ethan Caldwell announced he would marry, people were surprised. When he announced who he would marry, they were baffled. Lillian Hart was 26 and unremarkable in every way that mattered to frontier society. She wasn't beautiful in the dramatic sense. No cascading golden hair or porcelain skin that inspired sonnets. She was slender and brown-haired, with clever gray eyes and a posture that suggested she'd spent her life trying not to take up too much space. Her father had been a school teacher who drank himself into an early grave. Her mother had died bringing her into the world. She had no land, no connections, no dowry worth mentioning. What she had was a warehouse. Not a particularly impressive warehouse, a weathered structure on the eastern edge of Greystone settlement that her father had won in a card game and somehow never lost despite his other failures. But it sat on a crucial junction where 3 of Ethan's trade routes converged, and the previous owner, Lillian's late father, had refused to sell at any price out of pure spite for land-grabbing vultures. Lillian, practical to her bones, had no such spite. "I'll sell you the property," she told Ethan during their first meeting in his study, a room that felt more like a military command center than a home office. For $800 and a contract guaranteeing employment for the Henderson family, they've been managing the building for my father. Ethan had looked up from the survey maps spread across his desk. "The Hendersons are inefficient. I'd replace them within a month." "Then I'm not interested in selling." She'd said it without theatrics, without the trembling voice of someone making a brave stand. Just a simple statement of fact, delivered in the same tone you might use to decline tea. Ethan studied her properly then. She wore a dress that had been mended at the cuffs, and her hands had the rough patches of someone who did her own washing. But she sat straight, met his eyes without flinching, and didn't fidget under his silence. "The property is worth $500, perhaps $6 on a generous day," he said. "You're asking more than market value and imposing conditions. That's not how negotiations work." "You're right," Lillian agreed. "If this were a normal negotiation, but you've been trying to acquire this junction for 3 years, and every month you don't have it costs you in transport inefficiency." I did the math. "You lose approximately $200 monthly in extended routes. So actually, I'm offering you a bargain." The corner of Ethan's mouth had moved. Not quite a smile, but the suggestion that under different circumstances one might have appeared. "Marry me instead," he said. Lillian blinked, once. "Excuse me? I need a wife. Frontier law gives preferential water rights to establish family homesteads, and the eastern expansion requires access to the Crow River Basin. The territorial governor is a traditionalist. He'll grant claims to family men before single landholders." Ethan gestured at the maps. "Marriage is a legal partnership. I acquire the warehouse through marriage rather than purchase. You gain financial security and social standing. And the Hendersons keep their employment as part of the household staff. That's the most unromantic proposal in human history. I'm not interested in romance. I'm interested in efficiency. Lillian had laughed then, a short, startled sound that seemed to surprise her as much as him. And what do I do in this arrangement? Sit in your house and look decorative? You'd manage the household operations, represent the family at territorial functions, and oversee the domestic staff. It's not decorative work. This estate runs like a small business. The current housekeeper is 70 and wants to retire. I need someone capable. You need a property manager who shares your bed. Ethan's expression hadn't changed. The bed sharing is negotiable. I need a wife in legal terms. The rest is flexible. She should have been insulted. Any woman with proper pride would have thrown the offer back in his face and stormed out. But Lillian Hart had stopped believing in fairy tales around the same time she'd started selling her mother's jewelry to buy her father's whiskey. She'd looked around Ethan's study, the orderly shelves, the precise stacks of correspondence, the complete absence of anything personal or warm. Then she'd looked at her own future, a warehouse she couldn't profitably manage alone, a territory where unmarried women had exactly 3 career options: teacher, seamstress, or something mentioned only in whispers. And the slow slide into genteel poverty. I want separate bedrooms, she'd said finally, and control over the household budget without requiring your approval for every expenditure under $50. Done. And the Hendersons get a pension plan. Define pension plan. They'd negotiated for another hour, hammering out the terms of their marriage like merchants arguing over a shipping contract. By the end, they had an agreement that was precise, equitable, and completely devoid of any pretense about affection. They were married 3 weeks later in a ceremony that lasted 12 minutes. The Caldwell estate sat on a rise overlooking the settlement like a fortress watching its territory. It wasn't beautiful. Ethan didn't build for beauty. The house was stone and timber, designed to withstand the brutal winters and equally brutal summers of Greystone territory. Thick walls, small windows, a layout that prioritized function over form. Lillian arrived with 1 trunk of belongings and no illusions. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper, greeted her at the door with the kind of cautious warmth you'd show a new barn cat. Wait and see if it's friendly before getting attached. Your room is on the 2nd floor, east wing, Mrs. Henderson said, leading Lillian upstairs that didn't creak because Ethan maintained everything with mechanical precision. Mr. Caldwell's quarters are west wing. The main study is ground floor, off limits during business hours. Breakfast is at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 7 sharp. Does Mr. Caldwell always eat on schedule? Mr. Caldwell does everything on schedule, ma'am. The bedroom was adequate, clean, functional. A bed, a wardrobe, a desk by the window overlooking the eastern fields. No personal touches, no decorations, nothing that suggested anyone had ever actually lived here rather than just occupied the space. It's very... Lillian searched for a polite word. Practical, Mrs. Henderson finished. That's Mr. Caldwell's way. He'll provide everything you need, ma'am. Just don't expect what you don't need. Lillian unpacked her trunk in silence. Her few dresses went in the wardrobe. Her mother's music box, one of the last items she hadn't sold, went on the desk. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day, both looking impossibly young and hopeful, went beside it. She stood there for a moment, looking at her mother's face. Margaret Hart had married for love, and it had given her 1 year of happiness before childbirth killed her. Her father had loved her mother so deeply that losing her had hollowed him out, left him a walking ghost who drowned his grief 1 bottle at a time. Love hadn't saved either of them. Maybe Ethan's way was smarter. No love meant no loss. No hope meant no disappointment. It was a very sensible philosophy. It was also, Lillian thought, the saddest thing she'd ever heard. Their first dinner together set the pattern for everything that followed. Ethan sat at the head of the table with a stack of correspondence beside his plate. Lillian sat to his right, close enough to be proper, far enough to be essentially alone. Mrs. Henderson served pot roast with potatoes, good, solid food with no pretensions. They ate in silence for 5 minutes before Lillian attempted conversation. The eastern fields look productive. Wheat yields are up 11% from last year, Ethan replied without looking up from a letter about timber contracts. The new rotation system is proving effective. That's good. Yes. More silence. Lillian tried again. I met some of the household staff this afternoon. They seem, if there are performance issues, report them to Mrs. Henderson. She handles personnel matters. There aren't issues, then there's no need to discuss it. Lillian set down her fork carefully. Do you plan to read correspondence through every meal? Ethan glanced up, genuinely puzzled by the question. It's efficient use of time. It's rude. We're not entertaining guests. There's no one to be rude to. I'm someone. He looked at her then, really looked, as if noticing her for the first time since they'd sat down. His eyes were an unusual shade of blue, pale, almost gray, like ice over deep water. Handsome, objectively, if you like the stern, uncompromising type. Lillian supposed some women would find him attractive. She found him exhausting. You're right, Ethan said finally. That was discourteous. He set the letter aside and gave her his full attention, which somehow felt worse, like being examined under harsh light. What would you like to discuss? He asked. The question was so stiff, so formal, that Lillian nearly laughed. This was a man who could negotiate water rights and timber contracts, who ran an empire of land and infrastructure, but basic human conversation left him floundering. Never mind, she said. Finish your letters. I'll adjust. Something flickered across his face. Relief, maybe, or disappointment. Though she doubted Ethan Caldwell did disappointment. He picked up the correspondence again, and they finished the meal in silence. This was her life now. Adequate, functional, practical. Lillian had agreed to it with open eyes. She had no right to complain. But that night, alone in her practical bedroom in her practical marriage, she let herself have one small, impractical moment of grief for the girl who'd once believed in different possibilities. Then she put it away, dried her eyes, and got on with things. That was what you did. You got on with things. The territory of Greystone was beautiful, the way a knife is beautiful, all sharp edges and brutal efficiency. In the weeks that followed her marriage, Lillian began to understand the place she'd married into. This wasn't civilized country. The nearest city was 3 days hard travel. The nearest law enforcement was a single territorial marshal who covered an area the size of a small country. Out here, you solved your own problems, or you didn't survive. The settlement centered around Caldwell's trading post and grain storage, but families were scattered across hundreds of square miles, homesteaders trying to scratch farms from difficult soil, ranchers running cattle on land that barely supported grass, trappers working the northern forests. They came to the main settlement once a month for supplies, and Lillian began to see them during those visits. Families with children who looked half-starved even in good months. Men with hands scarred from work and eyes that carried the weight of impossible decisions. Women who aged decades and years, worn down by labor and loss and the constant grinding fear that one bad season would end everything. Ethan's operation was the spine that held it all together. His grain storage prevented starvation in bad winters. His trading post provided supplies at fair prices, or as fair as frontier economics allowed. His roads and wells made the difference between a territory that functioned and one that collapsed into chaos. He ruled it all with the same cold precision he brought to everything. Collins is 3 months behind on his loan, Ethan said one evening, reviewing accounts in his study. Lillian had started joining him there after dinner, not because he invited her, but because sitting alone in her room felt pathetic. He never told her to leave, so she stayed, reading by the fire while he worked. Which one is Collins? She asked. Homesteader, northeast section, 40 acres, mostly wheat. Is he going to lose the farm? If he can't make payment by spring. Ethan's tone held no particular emotion, just fact. I'll foreclose and sell to someone more capable. Lillian looked up from her book. What happens to his family? That's not my concern. He has children. That's still not my concern. Ethan signed a document without pausing. I run a business, not a charity. If I allowed sentiment to dictate policy, the entire system would collapse. 15 other families depend on my operation remaining solvent. I can't save everyone. You're not being asked to save everyone, just to show some flexibility to a man who's probably working himself to death. Flexibility becomes precedent. If I extend Collins's loan, every other struggling homesteader will expect the same treatment. The operation doesn't survive on compassion. And Collins doesn't survive on your rigid policies. Ethan finally looked up, and there was something almost like curiosity in his expression. You think I'm being cruel. I think you're being practical, which is somehow worse. Explain. Lillian set down her book. Cruelty is personal. It's passion, even if it's dark passion. What you're doing is mechanical. You're making decisions about people's lives the way you'd decide which field to plant or which road to repair first. Efficient, logical, completely devoid of recognition that these are human beings, not assets on a ledger. And your alternative would be what? Extend loans indefinitely? Watch my own operation fail trying to prop up every struggling farmer? This territory needs structure, not sentiment. I'm not arguing against structure. I'm arguing against using structure as an excuse to avoid empathy. They stared at each other across the study. Lillian in her chair by the fire, Ethan at his fortress of a desk. Outside, wind rattled the windows. November was settling into the territory, bringing the first hints of the brutal winter to come. I'll ride out to Collins's place next week, Ethan said finally. Assess the situation personally. If there's potential for recovery, I'll consider a modified payment plan. It wasn't compassion. It wasn't even flexibility, really. Just Ethan being thorough, making sure he had all the data before making a decision. But Lillian decided to count it as progress anyway. Thank you, she said. Ethan grunted and returned to his paperwork. Lillian picked up her book. The fire crackled. Outside, winter was coming, and inside the Caldwell house, two people who'd married for every reason except affection were starting to learn each other's languages. The settlement's monthly gathering happened on the first Saturday of each month, weather permitting. Families came from all over the territory to trade, socialize, and remember they weren't completely alone on the frontier. This was Lillian's first time attending as Mrs. Caldwell. She'd expected some curiosity, natural when the territory's most prominent landowner suddenly acquired a wife. What she hadn't expected was the wall of polite distance that met her at every turn. The other women were cordial but cool. They greeted her, made appropriate small talk, then found excuses to drift away. After the fourth conversation that ended with, "Oh, I must check on the children," Lillian understood. They were afraid of her, or more accurately, afraid of her husband by extension. "Don't take it personal," Mrs. Henderson murmured, appearing at Lillian's elbow with a cup of coffee. "They don't dislike you, they just don't know where you stand." "Where I stand?" "With Mr. Caldwell. Whether you're like him, all business and no heart, or whether you're someone they can actually talk to." "And which would be better for me, being feared or being accessible?" Mrs. Henderson smiled. "That depends on what kind of woman you want to be, ma'am." Lillian watched Ethan across the gathering space. He stood near the trading post entrance, discussing something with Thomas Brennan, the territory's lead surveyor. Even in casual conversation, Ethan maintained perfect posture, perfect control. He never laughed, never gestured expansively, never showed any of the loose warmth that characterized frontier social interaction. People respected him, deferred to him, brought him their problems and trusted his solutions. But nobody seemed to actually like him. "Mrs. Caldwell?" Lillian turned to find a woman about her age, holding a toddler on one hip and looking uncertain about approaching. She had the worn hands and faded dress of someone for whom life was a constant struggle, but her eyes were kind. "Yes?" "I'm Sarah Collins, my husband Robert. He farms northeast of here?" The name clicked. The man Ethan was considering foreclosing on. "Of course," Lillian said, keeping her voice neutral. "How can I help you?" Sarah shifted the toddler, clearly uncomfortable. "I heard, that is, Mr. Caldwell mentioned he might be riding out our way next week, to assess things. I wanted to ask..." She trailed off, looking miserable. "You want to know if he's going to take your farm. We've had a hard year, Mrs. Caldwell. Lost half the wheat to early frost, then Robert hurt his back during harvest. Couldn't work for 6 weeks. We're not lazy people. We're not trying to cheat anyone. We just..." Her voice cracked. "We have 3 children and nowhere else to go." The toddler on her hip, maybe 2 years old, grabbed at his mother's collar, oblivious to the adult fears swirling around him. He had the same bright eyes as Sarah, the same stubborn set to his jaw. Lillian thought about her conversation with Ethan, about structure and sentiment, about the difference between running a business and recognizing humanity. "Mrs. Collins, I can't make promises about decisions that aren't mine to make, she said carefully. But I can tell you that my husband is thorough. If there's a way to make your situation work, he'll find it. He's not interested in destroying families. He's interested in solutions that benefit the territory. It was diplomatic, truthful, even, and completely inadequate to the fear in Sarah Collins's eyes. Thank you, Sarah whispered, though they both knew Lillian had offered nothing concrete. She shifted the toddler again and drifted back into the crowd, shoulders hunched against disappointment. Lillian stood there, coffee going cold in her hands, and felt the weight of her position for the first time. She was Mrs. Caldwell now. That title carried power, power she hadn't asked for and wasn't sure she wanted. But it was hers whether she wanted it or not. The question was what she'd do with it. Winter arrived in Greystone territory the way it always did, sudden and absolute. One week the weather was manageable, the next week temperatures plummeted and the first heavy snow turned the world white. Roads became difficult, then dangerous, then impassable. Families that had waited too long to stock supplies found themselves trapped with insufficient food and fuel. This was when Ethan's infrastructure showed its value. The grain storage, the supply routes he'd spent years establishing, the network of dependencies he'd carefully constructed. It all worked exactly as designed. 17 families requesting extended credit for winter supplies, Ethan said, reviewing the Trading Post ledgers. December had locked down hard, and he'd been working even longer hours than usual, managing the complex logistics of keeping people alive through the season. Are you going to grant it? Lillian asked. 12 are solid risks. The others, he marked something in the ledger. I'll provide minimal supplies at cost, enough to survive winter. Any more would be enabling failure. Enabling failure, Lillian repeated. That's how you see giving people food during winter? As enabling their failure? I see it as distinguishing between temporary hardship and fundamental incompetence. Ethan's tone was patient, as if explaining basic mathematics. Some families are struggling because of circumstances beyond their control, bad luck, illness, weather. Those families I help because they'll recover and contribute. Others are struggling because they're lazy, drunk, or incapable of basic planning. Helping them just postpones inevitable collapse. And you can tell the difference? I've been managing this territory for 8 years. Yes, I can tell the difference. The frustrating thing was, he was probably right. Ethan's judgment of character was brutal but accurate. He could assess a person's capabilities within 10 minutes of conversation and predict their trajectory with uncomfortable precision. But that didn't make it feel less cold. The Mackenzie family is on your minimal supplies list, Lillian said, scanning the names. Why? Daniel Mackenzie drinks his earnings and beats his wife. I'm not subsidizing that. So you'll let his children go hungry to punish him? I'll provide basic supplies, flour, dried beans, salt, enough to keep the children fed if the mother is competent. But I won't give him credit he'll drink away or supplies he'll waste. That's not punishment, that's reality. Lillian wanted to argue, but she'd met Daniel Mackenzie once, briefly, at the settlement gathering. Ethan's assessment was accurate. The man had shown up half drunk and aggressive, and his wife had flinched when he'd raised his voice, sometimes practical and moral aligned in uncomfortable ways. What about the Collins family? She asked. Full credit extension through spring. Robert Collins is a capable farmer who had a bad season. He'll recover. Ethan had ridden out to the Collins farm the previous week, as promised. When he'd returned, he'd added them to the grant extension list without comment. Lillian had wanted to ask what he'd found, what had changed his assessment, but she'd learned that Ethan didn't explain his decisions. He just made them and moved on. Thank you, she said now, for helping them. I'm not helping them. I'm making a sound business decision based on risk assessment. Sure, keep telling yourself that. The corner of Ethan's mouth moved, that almost smile that appeared sometimes when she challenged him. He returned to his ledgers, and Lillian returned to her own work. She'd taken over managing the household accounts and had discovered she was actually good at it. Her father had taught her basic bookkeeping, and she'd built on that knowledge, finding efficiencies Ethan had missed. He'd noticed, hadn't complimented her work, that wasn't his way, but he'd started asking her opinion on household-related expenditures. It was almost like being partners. Almost. What? Christmas came and went with minimal acknowledgement, Ethan didn't celebrate holidays. They were inefficient interruptions to productivity. Lillian hung some pine boughs in the main hall and called it festive. January was harder. The cold deepened and the snow kept coming. 3 families lost livestock. 1 homestead burned down when a chimney fire got out of control. The territory contracted, everyone pulling inward to survive, and Lillian started to notice something. People came to the house now. Not to see Ethan. They still approached him with the same wary respect. They came to see her. Sarah Collins arrived one afternoon with a basket of preserves, ostensibly as thanks for Ethan's credit extension. But after the appropriate pleasantries, she'd hesitated. "Mrs. Caldwell, could I ask your advice about something?" They'd ended up in the kitchen, drinking tea while Sarah explained her worries about her middle child, who wasn't reading as well as he should. Lillian had suggested some teaching methods her father had used, had offered to lend some of his old books. Then Martha Brennan had shown up the next week, asking if Lillian knew anything about treating croup in children. Then Anna Chen had come by to ask if Mr. Caldwell might consider extending the trading post hours on Saturdays. Then Elizabeth Whitmore had wanted to know if there was any way to get seed catalogs before spring planting season. Small questions. Practical things. Nothing dramatic, but they were coming to her instead of going to Ethan. "You're becoming the bridge," Mrs. Henderson observed one evening, watching Lillian organize a pile of borrowed books to distribute to families with children. "Between Mr. Caldwell and the territory. They trust him to run things, but they trust you to understand them. I'm not doing anything special, just listening." "That's what's special, ma'am." "Mr. Caldwell doesn't listen, not really. He assesses, he evaluates, he makes decisions, but he doesn't just hear people. You do." Lillian hadn't thought of it that way, but she realized Mrs. Henderson was right. When people talked to Ethan, they presented problems requiring solutions. When they talked to her, they shared their lives, their fears, their hopes, the small human details that didn't fit in ledgers. She was becoming part of the territory in a way Ethan never had. The question was whether that mattered, whether being trusted by people who ultimately had no power made any difference in a world Ethan controlled. She didn't know yet, but she was starting to think it might. February brought the crisis. It started with a late-season blizzard that hit harder than anyone expected. Then the temperature dropped further, brutal even by Greystone standards. Then the North Road, one of Ethan's carefully maintained supply routes, became impassable, which meant the families on the northeast section, already struggling, were completely cut off. "We'll wait for the weather to clear," Ethan said, studying weather reports and road conditions. Attempting to navigate in these conditions would be suicide. "How long until the weather clears?" 4 days, maybe 5. "And how long can those families last without supplies?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Unknown. They should have adequate stores if they planned properly. And if they didn't, then they'll learn a hard lesson about frontier preparedness." Lillian stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I'm perfectly serious. I won't risk men's lives on a rescue mission for people who failed to plan ahead. The territory doesn't survive through reckless heroics. The territory doesn't survive by abandoning people. I'm not abandoning anyone. I'm waiting for conditions that allow safe travel. That's called being rational." They'd argued, the first real argument of their marriage. Lillian had pushed, Ethan had refused, and they'd reached an impasse that felt insurmountable. That night, alone in her room, Lillian made a decision. She'd seen the smaller supply wagon in the barn, the one used for local deliveries. She'd watched the workers prepare winter travel gear. She'd memorized the route maps Ethan kept in his study. She knew it was dangerous. Knew it was exactly the kind of reckless action Ethan would call inefficient and emotional. But she also knew that somewhere in that northeast section, Sarah Collins's children might be going hungry. That families were probably terrified, wondering if anyone remembered they existed. Someone had to go. If Ethan wouldn't, she would. Lillian left before dawn, taking the supply wagon and enough provisions to help the northeast families through the rest of winter. She left a note, brief, factual, giving her route and expected return. She didn't ask permission because she knew Ethan would refuse. The first hour was manageable, cold, difficult, but navigable. The second hour got worse. By the third hour, Lillian understood why Ethan had refused to send anyone. The snow was deeper than she'd realized. The temperature was dropping. The wind cut through her heavy coat like it was paper. The horse struggled, and Lillian struggled to control the wagon on roads that were barely visible under the snow. But she kept going. Because turning back felt like admitting Ethan was right. That efficiency mattered more than people, that structure was more important than compassion. And Lillian couldn't accept that. She made it to the first homestead, the Morrison family. They'd been down to their last week of flour, rationing carefully, trying to make it last. They wept when they saw her. "Mrs. Caldwell, we didn't think anyone would come." "Someone always comes," Lillian said. Though her hands were shaking from cold and exhaustion, she made it to the second family, the third, the fourth. By the fifth homestead, the Collins farm, she was running on pure determination. Her hands were numb. Her feet had lost feeling hours ago. The horse was exhausted. "You're crazy," Robert Collins said, but his eyes were wet. "Completely crazy for doing this." "Probably," Lillian agreed. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, distant, slightly slurred. She left half her remaining supplies with the Collins family. She had 2 more homesteads to reach. She never made it. The storm that hit on her return journey was the kind that frontier people talked about for years afterward. The kind that killed experienced travelers and buried landmarks under feet of new snow. Lillian felt the wagon tip, felt herself falling, felt the stunning cold of deep snow. Then she felt nothing at all. They found her 12 hours later. Ethan had realized she was gone within 2 hours of dawn, had read her note, understood instantly what she'd done, and felt something he hadn't felt in years. Pure, undiluted terror. He'd assembled every capable rider, mapped her route, and led the search himself. When they found the overturned wagon, supplies scattered across the snow and no sign of Lillian, something broke in Ethan's chest that he'd thought was too frozen to break. They found her 100 yards from the wagon, curled against a boulder, barely breathing. Ethan carried her himself, held her against his chest during the brutal ride back, willing his own warmth into her frozen body. She woke once during the journey, her gray eyes unfocused and confused. "The families," she whispered. "Did they—" "They're fine," Ethan said, his voice rough. "You reached them. They're fine." "Good." Her eyes closed again. "Told you someone always comes." Ethan looked down at his wife, this woman he'd married for property and convenience, who'd nearly died because she'd decided compassion mattered more than safety, and felt the foundations of his carefully controlled world shift. "You're insane," he said quietly. Lillian, barely conscious, smiled. "Probably." By the time they reached the house, she was unconscious again. And Ethan Caldwell, who'd spent his entire adult life believing that emotion was inefficiency and love was weakness, realized he was absolutely terrified of losing her. Not because of what her death would mean for his household management, not because of property rights or social standing or any of the practical reasons he'd married her, but because somewhere in the past months, while he'd been focused on ledgers and logistics, Lillian Hart had become the first person in his life he actually gave a damn about. And he'd almost lost her because he'd been too rigid to see that some things, some people, mattered more than efficiency. Dr. Patterson worked through the night, treating frostbite and hypothermia while Ethan paced outside the bedroom like a caged animal. Mrs. Henderson had never seen him like this, disheveled, frantic, completely stripped of his usual control. "She's strong," the housekeeper said quietly. "She'll fight." "She shouldn't have to fight. She shouldn't have been out there in the first place." "No, sir, she shouldn't have been. But she went anyway, because that's who she is." Ethan stopped pacing. "This is my fault." "How do you figure?" "I refused to send help. I prioritized safety over action. I let practical concerns override moral ones." He ran a hand through his hair, another first, showing disorder. "I made her think the only way to help those families was to risk herself. You made a reasonable decision based on available information." "My wife is dying because of my reasonable decision." The words hung in the air. My wife. Not Mrs. Caldwell. Not the household manager. My wife. Mrs. Henderson smiled. "She's not dying, Mr. Caldwell. She's fighting, just like she fought through that storm to reach people who needed help. Just like she's fought to make a place for herself here. In this cold house you run like a business." She paused. "The question is, when she wakes up, what kind of house is she going to wake up to? The same one she left? Or something different? Ethan looked at the closed bedroom door. Behind it, Lillian was fighting for her life because she'd believed compassion was worth risking death for, and he was standing out here still trying to calculate the right answer. That had to change. He had to change. When Dr. Patterson finally emerged, gray with exhaustion, Ethan's heart stopped. "She'll live," the doctor said. "Lost 2 toes to frostbite. She'll have pain for months, maybe years, but she'll live." Ethan sat down hard on the nearest chair, all the strength going out of his legs. "Can I see her?" "She's sleeping, needs rest, but—" Dr. Patterson hesitated. "Yes, I think you should. I think she'll rest better knowing you're there." Ethan entered the bedroom quietly. Lillian looked impossibly small in the bed, her face pale against the white pillows. Her hands, bandaged where frostbite had damaged fingers, lay still on the blankets. He sat in the chair beside the bed and for the first time in years didn't know what to do. So he just sat and waited and made a promise to the unconscious woman who'd somehow become essential to his carefully controlled world. When she woke up, things would be different. He would be different, because Lillian Hart had gone into a storm to save people. And Ethan Caldwell realized that maybe, just maybe, some things were worth more than efficiency. Some things were worth everything. Lillian woke to pain. Not the sharp, immediate kind that makes you gasp. This was deeper, slower, like her body was remembering piece by piece what had happened to it. Her hands throbbed. Her feet felt like they belonged to someone else. Her chest ached with each breath. And someone was holding her hand. She turned her head, even that hurt, and found Ethan asleep in the chair beside her bed. He looked terrible. His shirt was wrinkled, his jaw shadowed with days of stubble, his hair disheveled in a way she'd never seen. He'd pulled the chair close enough that he could rest his forehead against her bandaged hand, his fingers wrapped carefully around her wrist, like he was afraid she'd disappear if he let go. "You look awful," Lillian whispered. Ethan's head snapped up. For a moment he just stared at her, and something in his expression made her chest tighten in a way that had nothing to do with hypothermia. "You're awake." Apparently. She tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Everything hurt. "Don't move. Dr. Patterson said—" Ethan stopped, swallowed hard. "You lost 2 toes. Frostbite damage to your fingers. Possible lung complications from exposure. You've been unconscious for 3 days. 3 days? You nearly died." His voice was flat, but his hand hadn't released her wrist. "Because you went into a blizzard to deliver supplies I specifically said weren't worth the risk." Lillian met his eyes. "Were those families worth the risk?" "That's not the point." "It's exactly the point." They stared at each other, Ethan still holding her wrist, Lillian pale and damaged but absolutely unrepentant. Outside, February wind rattled the windows. Inside, something fundamental had shifted. "I was wrong," Ethan said finally. Lillian blinked. "What?" "I was wrong. About waiting for safe conditions. About prioritizing risk management over immediate action. About—" He stopped, struggling with words in a way she'd never seen. "About a lot of things." "Ethan, you went into that storm because I left you no choice. Because my version of rational leadership meant families would starve while I waited for optimal conditions." His grip on her wrist tightened slightly. "You almost died proving me wrong. And you were right." Lillian didn't know what to say. This was Ethan Caldwell, the man who never admitted mistakes, never showed vulnerability, never let emotion interfere with logic. And he was sitting here looking wrecked and raw and completely undone. "The families?" she asked quietly. "All safe. Your supplies got them through. Sarah Collins sends her gratitude. She wanted to visit, but Dr. Patterson won't allow visitors yet. And you're angry with me." "I'm—" Ethan stopped, seemed to search for the right word. "I'm terrified. I spent 3 days not knowing if you'd wake up. 3 days wondering what I'd do if you didn't. That's not anger. That's something I don't have words for." He stood abruptly, releasing her wrist, and walked to the window. His shoulders were tight, his posture rigid, falling back into control because that's what he knew. "When you're recovered," he said to the window, "we need to talk. About how this household operates. About my decisions and your input. About—" He turned back to face her. "About what kind of marriage this actually is." Before Lillian could respond, he was gone, the door closing quietly behind him. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to process what had just happened. Ethan Caldwell had admitted he was wrong, had admitted he was scared, had suggested their marriage might be more than a business arrangement. Outside, winter still held Greystone territory in its brutal grip. But inside, something was finally starting to thaw. Recovery was slow and painful and frustrating. Dr. Patterson had been clear. Lillian was lucky to be alive, but luck didn't mean easy. The frostbite damage would heal mostly, but she'd always have sensitivity to cold. Walking would be difficult for months, and the lung inflammation from exposure meant she tired easily, her breath coming short after minimal exertion. "You'll adjust," the doctor said during one of his daily visits. "The body is remarkably adaptable, but you need to be patient." Patience had never been Lillian's strength. She spent the first week confined to bed, which gave her too much time to think about Ethan's words, about the expression on his face when she'd woken, about the careful way he'd held her wrist, like she was something precious that might break. He visited every evening, sitting in the chair beside her bed for exactly 30 minutes. They talked about territory business, supplies, road conditions, which families needed additional support. Safe topics, practical topics. Neither of them mentioned what he'd said that first morning, but something had changed in how he looked at her, in how he listened when she spoke, in the way his hand would sometimes reach out, as if to touch her, before he caught himself and pulled back. Mrs. Henderson noticed. "He's different," the housekeeper said one afternoon, helping Lillian into a chair by the window. "Not just with you, with everyone. Thomas Brennan came by yesterday with a road repair proposal, and Mr. Caldwell actually asked him about his family before discussing business." "That doesn't sound like Ethan." "No, ma'am. It doesn't. That's what I mean." Lillian looked out the window at the snow-covered estate. "People don't change that quickly. People don't usually get scared enough to change. But you scared him, Mrs. Caldwell. Scared him proper." "I didn't mean to." "I know. But maybe that's what he needed. Someone to make him feel something strong enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore." By the third week, Lillian was allowed downstairs for short periods. Her feet still hurt, wrapped in bandages that made walking awkward, but she was determined to reclaim some independence. She found Ethan in his study, as always, but the scene was different than she expected. Robert Collins sat across from Ethan's desk, looking uncomfortable in clean clothes that were clearly borrowed. His hands, work-roughened and scarred, twisted his hat nervously. "I can't accept this, Mr. Caldwell," Robert was saying. "It's too generous. It's not generosity, it's investment." Ethan's tone was businesslike, but not cold. "You've proven yourself capable. The territory needs capable farmers. I'm offering you an expansion loan, 20 additional acres at favorable terms. You'll repay it through percentage of yield over 5 years. But my current loan is restructured as I explained. You focus on working the land. I'll handle the financial logistics." Robert shook his head, overwhelmed. "Why would you do this after I nearly lost everything?" Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Because someone I respect reminded me that the territory isn't just infrastructure and supply chains. It's people. And sometimes investing in people is the smartest decision you can make." Robert noticed Lillian in the doorway. He stood quickly, hat clutched to his chest. "Mrs. Caldwell, Sarah wanted me to tell you, we named our daughter after you, born 2 weeks ago, Lillian Grace Collins." Lillian felt her throat tighten. "You didn't have to. You saved our lives, ma'am. All of us. The least we can do is remember it." After Robert left, Lillian stayed in the doorway, watching Ethan make notes in his ledger. He knew she was there. She could tell by the slight tension in his shoulders, but he didn't look up. "You restructured his loan," she said finally. "It made financial sense. You gave him expansion capital. The territory needs agricultural development. You're doing what I asked, showing flexibility." Ethan set down his pen and finally met her eyes. "I'm doing what should have been done from the start. You were right. About Collins, about the Northeast families, about—" he gestured vaguely. "Most things, it turns out." Lillian moved into the room carefully, her bandaged feet making her gait uneven. Ethan stood immediately, moving to help her, but she waved him off. "I can walk." "You shouldn't be downstairs yet." "I was going insane up there." She made it to the chair Robert had vacated and sat with relief. Ethan remained standing, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "We need to talk," he said. "About what I said when you woke up." "I remember. I meant it. All of it." He moved back to his desk but didn't sit, standing there like a man preparing to deliver difficult testimony. This marriage was supposed to be a practical arrangement. Mutual benefit, no complications. That was the agreement. It was a stupid agreement. Lillian blinked. "Excuse me?" I approached marriage the way I approached everything, as a problem requiring a logical solution. Acquire a wife, manage the household, maintain social standing. All very efficient, all very rational. He finally looked at her directly. All very empty. "Ethan, let me finish, please." He took a breath. "When I thought you were dead, when we found you in that snow, I realized that I'd been lying to myself. This wasn't just a practical arrangement. Not for me. Not anymore. The study was very quiet. Outside, wind moved through bare trees. Inside, Ethan Caldwell was dismantling his own carefully constructed walls. "I don't know how to do this," he continued. "I don't know how to be a husband in any real sense. I don't know how to navigate emotion or express feelings or any of the things normal people do naturally, but I'm asking, if you're willing, to let me try. To let us try to make this marriage something more than a business contract." Lillian sat very still, processing. This was Ethan being vulnerable. Ethan admitting uncertainty. Ethan asking rather than dictating. "What exactly are you proposing?" she asked carefully. "I don't know. That's the problem. I don't have a plan or a strategy or a logical framework." He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture of disorder she was seeing more often. "I just know that I don't want to go back to how things were. Separate routines, polite distance. You living in one part of this house while I live in another, both of us pretending that's sufficient. And what do you want instead? You. Actually you. Not just Mrs. Caldwell, the household manager. Lillian Hart, who argues with me about loan policies and risks her life in blizzards and makes people feel seen in ways I never could." He paused. "If you're willing, if I haven't ruined this completely." Lillian looked at her husband, this difficult, rigid man who was trying so hard to be something different. It would be easy to say yes, to accept his fumbling attempt at change and hope it stuck. But she'd learned something during her weeks of recovery. She'd learned that she had power in this marriage, real power, earned through action and choice. And she wasn't going to give that up for the promise of romance. "I have conditions," she said. Ethan nodded. "Of course. First, I want real partnership, not you making decisions and occasionally asking my opinion, actual equal input on how this territory operates." "Agreed." "Second, I want you to stop treating people like assets on a ledger. That means listening to them, seeing them as human beings with complicated lives, not just risk assessments. I'm working on that." "Third," she met his eyes steadily, "if we're going to try to build something real, then I need you to actually let me in. Not just the parts of you that are efficient and controlled, the messy parts, the uncertain parts, the parts you keep locked down because they're not productive." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "That's the hardest one. I know. I've spent my entire adult life building walls, keeping everything controlled and separate and managed. What you're asking, it goes against every instinct I have. I'm not asking you to change overnight. I'm asking you to try. To actually try, not just say the words and then retreat back to what's comfortable." He nodded slowly. "If I fail at this, if I can't be what you need, then we'll figure it out, together, like actual partners." Lillian leaned forward despite the pain in her feet. "But I won't settle for half measures, Ethan. I won't be the wife who sits quietly in her practical bedroom while you rule your empire from a distance. Either we do this for real or we stay with the original arrangement. I need to know which." "For real," Ethan said immediately. "I want for real. Even though it's messy and uncertain and completely inefficient, especially because of that." They looked at each other across the study. These two people who'd married for property and convenience, now trying to navigate something neither of them fully understood. "Okay," Lillian said finally, "let's try." Ethan moved around the desk, closing the distance between them. He reached for her hand, carefully, aware of the healing damage, and held it gently. "Thank you," he said quietly. "Don't thank me yet. I'm probably going to make your life much more complicated. I'm counting on it." For the first time since their wedding, Lillian saw him smile. Not the almost smile, not the slight movement of his mouth. An actual smile, genuine and warm and completely transforming. Maybe this could work. Maybe they could build something real from the ruins of their practical arrangement. Maybe. Well, spring came slowly to Greystone territory, winter releasing its grip with reluctance. As the snow melted and the roads cleared, Lillian began to understand the full scope of what her storm rescue had meant. People looked at her differently now, not with the wary distance they'd shown Mrs. Caldwell the property acquisition, but with genuine warmth. Women who'd kept polite distance before now greeted her like a friend. Men who'd tipped their hats in formal respect now stopped to actually talk. She'd become part of the territory's story. The woman who'd risked everything when the territory's most powerful man had counseled patience. Not everyone was pleased about it. "There's been talk," Mrs. Henderson said carefully one morning in late March. "Some of the men, the ones who work directly for Mr. Caldwell, they're not happy about the changes." "What changes?" "Him asking your opinion on business decisions, restructuring loans after you speak with families, letting you have input on territory management." The housekeeper paused. "They think he's gone soft, that you're weakening his authority." Lillian set down her coffee carefully. "Who's saying this?" "Marcus Webb, mainly. He's been Mr. Caldwell's foreman for 6 years, and he's not pleased about a woman influencing policy." Marcus Webb. Lillian knew him. A hard man in his 40s, efficient and loyal to Ethan's old way of doing things. She'd met him twice, and both times he'd barely acknowledged her existence. What exactly is he saying? That Mr. Caldwell was right to let those families wait out the winter. That your storm rescue was reckless sentiment that got lucky. That if Mr. Caldwell keeps bending to his wife's soft heart, the whole territory operation will collapse. And do the other workers agree with him? Mrs. Henderson shook her head. Mixed. Some do. Mostly the older hands who've worked for Mr. Caldwell from the beginning. They liked how things were. Clear rules, hard decisions, no exceptions. But the younger ones, and most of the families, they see the changes as good, more flexible, more human. So we're dividing the territory. In a manner of speaking, yes, ma'am. Lillian stared out the kitchen window at the muddy spring landscape. She'd thought changing Ethan's approach would be a straightforward good. More compassion, better outcomes, happier people. She hadn't considered that some people preferred the old way. That mercy might look like weakness to men who'd built their lives on hard rules and harder consequences. Does Ethan know about this? If he does, he hasn't mentioned it. Lillian found Ethan in the barn, inspecting equipment that would be needed for spring planting. He looked up when she entered, and now, 3 months after her near death, he smiled when he saw her. Small progress, but real. How are the feet today? Manageable. She'd learned to walk without obvious limping, though the damaged toes still ached in cold weather. We need to talk about Marcus Webb. Ethan's expression shifted. Not quite back to the cold mask he used to wear, but definitely more guarded. What about him? Mrs. Henderson says he's questioning your decisions, saying you've gone soft, that my influence is weakening the territory's leadership. Marcus has always been outspoken. This is more than being outspoken. He's undermining you and using me as the excuse. Ethan set down the harness he'd been examining. What do you want me to do? Fire my most experienced foreman because he disagrees with policy changes. I want you to address it before it becomes a larger problem. Marcus is loyal. He's worked for me for 6 years without complaint. He's earned the right to speak his mind. Even when speaking his mind means questioning your authority in front of other workers? I'm not a tyrant, Lillian. I don't silence dissent. There's a difference between allowing dissent and allowing someone to erode your leadership. She moved closer, keeping her voice low. You've made changes. Good changes. But if you don't defend those changes, defend us, then people like Marcus will assume you're uncertain, that you'll eventually go back to the old way. Ethan was quiet, his jaw tight. You're asking me to choose between loyalty to a long-term worker and supporting you. I'm asking you to decide what kind of leader you want to be. The old kind, where efficiency matters more than people, or the new kind, where we actually try to balance both. They stared at each other in the dim barn, and Lillian could see him struggling. Ethan valued loyalty, valued experience, valued the men who'd helped him build his operation from nothing. But he'd also promised real partnership, promised to try to be different. "I'll talk to Marcus," he said finally, "but I'm not firing him unless there's clear insubordination." "I'm not asking you to fire him, just to make clear where you stand." Ethan nodded, but Lillian could see the tension in his shoulders. This was hard for him, navigating personal conflict, defending emotional decisions, choosing between competing loyalties. Welcome to being human, she thought. Welcome to the messy, complicated world of actually caring about things. The confrontation came 3 days later. Lillian didn't witness it directly, but she heard about it from Thomas Brennan, who'd been in the trading post when Marcus Webb made his move. Webb was holding court, Thomas explained, sitting in the Caldwell kitchen with coffee and the sheepish expression of a man bearing difficult news, telling anyone who'd listen that Mr. Caldwell had lost his edge, that letting you influence policy decisions was going to destroy everything he'd built. And what did Ethan do? Walked right up to him, in front of everyone, and said, "Well, I probably shouldn't repeat the exact words, Mrs. Caldwell, but the gist was that Webb could either support the new policies or find employment elsewhere." He fired him? No, ma'am. Gave him a choice. Said the territory was evolving, and anyone unwilling to evolve with it wasn't necessary to the operation. Then he said, Thomas paused, a slight smile appearing. He said that anyone who questioned his wife's judgment was questioning his judgment, since he'd chosen to marry a woman smarter than himself about things that actually mattered. Lillian felt something warm expand in her chest. He said that? In front of 15 witnesses. Webb tried to argue, said Mr. Caldwell was letting emotion cloud his business sense. And Mr. Caldwell said, "This is exact quote, ma'am. If emotion means recognizing that people aren't just assets on a ledger, then I'm guilty as charged, and I'm better for it." What did Marcus say? Nothing. Just walked out. He's still working, hasn't quit or been fired, but he knows where things stand now. After Thomas left, Lillian found Ethan in his study. He was staring at the account books without actually seeing them, his expression troubled. "You heard," he said without looking up. "Thomas told me. I might have handled it poorly. You handled it perfectly." Ethan finally looked at her. "I publicly sided with you over one of my most experienced workers. I essentially told him that my marriage influences my business decisions. That's not how you maintain professional authority. That's exactly how you maintain authentic leadership. Marcus has been with me since the beginning. He helped me build this operation when I had nothing, and I just..." He stopped, struggling. "I threw that loyalty back in his face because he criticized you." Lillian moved to his desk, sat in the chair across from him. "Did you throw it back? Or did you make clear that loyalty doesn't mean blind agreement with outdated policies? He wasn't wrong about everything. The old system worked. It was efficient. People knew where they stood. People knew where they stood because they had no choice. You controlled everything, and they survived at your discretion. That's not leadership. It's dominance. And what we're doing now, what is that? Partnership, community, actually giving a damn about whether people thrive instead of just survive." Ethan rubbed his face tiredly. "This is harder than I expected." "What is?" "Caring. When I didn't care, when I just made logical decisions based on optimal outcomes, it was simple. Now every decision carries weight. Every choice affects people I actually know, whose lives I actually value. It's exhausting." Lillian reached across the desk, took his hand. "Welcome to being human. It doesn't get easier, but it gets more real." He held her hand, his thumb moving absently over her knuckles. "I told Marcus you were smarter than me." "I heard." That was very diplomatic. It's also true. About things that matter. I can build infrastructure and manage logistics and calculate risk. But you understand people. You see them. I'm learning that maybe that's more important than anything I know how to do. We're good at different things. That's why partnership works. Theoretically, assuming I haven't just alienated my entire workforce by admitting I take direction from my wife. You don't take direction from me. You listen to me. There's a difference. Not to men like Marcus Webb. Then Marcus Webb can adjust or leave. The territory will survive without him. Ethan looked doubtful, but he didn't argue. They sat there in the study while afternoon light shifted across the floor, holding hands across the desk like the tentative partners they were trying to become. Outside, Greystone territory was waking up from winter. Inside, something more complicated was growing, something neither of them had planned for, and neither of them fully understood. But they were trying. That had to count for something. The real test came in mid-April. Spring flooding hit the southern section harder than anyone predicted. The Crow River, usually manageable, swelled over its banks and wiped out 3 homesteads, destroyed crops, and left a dozen families homeless overnight. The old Ethan would have assessed the damage, calculated the recovery costs, and written off the families who couldn't rebuild efficiently. The new Ethan, the one trying to balance compassion with pragmatism, stared at the disaster reports and had no idea what to do. Total loss is estimated at $12,000, he said, reviewing the surveyor's assessment. Rebuilding would cost another $8,000. The families have no reserves. They lost everything. Lillian looked at the numbers. They were devastating. Can the territory operation absorb those costs? If I liquidate reserves and delay the eastern expansion. But that puts the entire operation at risk. One bad harvest, one unexpected crisis, and we'd have no safety margin. And if you don't help them, those families are finished in Greystone. They'd have to leave, find work elsewhere, start over with nothing. They looked at each other across the study. This was the moment that mattered, the point where philosophy met reality and good intentions faced hard math. What do you want to do? Lillian asked. I don't know. That's the problem. The logical choice is clear. Protect the operation, maintain reserves, let the families relocate. But you don't want to do that. No, I don't. Ethan set down the reports, which means I'm making emotional decisions instead of rational ones, which is exactly what Marcus warned against. Or it means you're recognizing that some things are worth the risk. 12 families, Lillian. 12 families against the stability of the entire territory. The math doesn't work. Since when is everything about math? Since always. That's how I built this operation. Careful calculation, risk management, logical decision-making. Now you're asking me to ignore all of that because of feelings. They were both standing now, the argument escalating in a way that felt familiar and frustrating. I'm asking you to recognize that people aren't numbers, Lillian shot back. That sometimes the right decision isn't the most efficient one. And I'm trying to explain that if this operation fails, everyone suffers, those 12 families and the 100 others who depend on us. So we do nothing? Let them lose everything because the math doesn't work? I didn't say that. Then what are you saying? Ethan stopped, seemed to forcibly calm himself. When he spoke again, his voice was quieter but strained. I'm saying I don't know how to balance this. I don't know how to be the man who cares about people and also the man who keeps this territory functioning. And I'm terrified that trying to be both means I'll fail at everything. The honesty of it stopped Lillian cold. This was Ethan stripped down. No walls, no calculations, just raw fear and uncertainty. She moved around the desk, stood close enough to see the tension in his jaw, the exhaustion in his eyes. Then we figure it out together, she said quietly. We look at the options, weigh the risks, and make the best decision we can. Not the most efficient decision, not the most compassionate decision, the best one that we can actually live with. And if we're wrong, then we deal with the consequences, together. Ethan pulled her close, holding her like a man drowning. Lillian wrapped her arms around him and felt him shake slightly, this controlled, precise man finally letting himself be uncertain and afraid and human. I don't know how to do this, he whispered against her hair. Neither do I. We'll learn. They stood there in the study while outside, spring moved forward and disaster waited for their decision. And Lillian realized that this messy, uncertain, terrifying attempt to build something real was harder and more important than anything either of them had ever done. They worked through the night, running numbers and scenarios. By dawn, they had a plan. Not a perfect plan. Nothing about disaster recovery was perfect, but a plan they could both support. Ethan would provide immediate relief, temporary shelter, food, basic supplies. Then he'd offer the families a choice, relocation assistance to start fresh elsewhere, or rebuilding loans at minimal interest with extended repayment terms. The families who chose to rebuild would work together, pooling labor, sharing resources, helping each other construct new homesteads. Ethan would provide materials and supervision. The territory would absorb some losses but recover most costs through the loan structure. It wasn't pure compassion, families would still carry debt. But it wasn't pure pragmatism either. Ethan was accepting risks he'd never have considered before. It was compromise, real partnership in action. This could still fail, Ethan said, reviewing their final calculations as sunrise colored the windows. If too many families can't repay loans, if recovery takes longer than projected, then we'll adapt, like we always do. He looked at her, this woman who'd somehow become essential to every decision he made. When did you become the optimist in this marriage? Someone has to balance your constant catastrophizing. I don't catastrophize. I assess realistic worst-case scenarios. Same thing. Ethan actually laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him by exhaustion and relief and the strange intimacy of making difficult decisions together. Come here, he said quietly. Lillian moved into his arms, and this time when he kissed her, it wasn't tentative or uncertain. It was real. The kiss of a man who'd finally stopped calculating odds and started taking risks. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. I love you, he said. I don't know when it happened or how, but I do. And it terrifies me. Lillian's heart stumbled. Why does it terrify you? Because loving someone means they can destroy you, and you. You could destroy me completely. I won't. You can't promise that. No, Lillian agreed. I can't, but I can promise to try not to, and to be here even when everything's uncertain and terrifying and nothing makes sense. Ethan pulled her closer, and they stood there as dawn broke over Greystone territory. Two people who'd married for property and convenience, now holding each other like the world might end if they let go. Outside, disaster waited. Inside, something improbable and fragile and absolutely real was growing, and neither of them had any idea if they'd survive what was coming, but they'd face it together. That had to be enough. But by the end of April, it became clear that nothing was enough. The flooding hadn't just destroyed homesteads, it had exposed cracks in Greystone's foundation that Ethan's careful infrastructure couldn't patch. Wells were contaminated, roads had washed out completely in sections, and the families who'd accepted rebuilding loans were discovering that starting over on ruined land was harder than anyone had calculated. Ethan worked 18-hour days, managing recovery efforts while trying to keep the regular operation functional. Lillian watched him deteriorate, sleep-deprived, increasingly short-tempered, falling back into old patterns of cold efficiency because compassion required energy he didn't have. We need to delay the eastern expansion, she said one evening in early May, finding him at his desk surrounded by reports that all told the same story. They were hemorrhaging resources faster than projected. No. Ethan, the numbers, I know the numbers. Delaying expansion means losing the water rights window. We miss that, and the McBride Consortium claims the Crow River Basin. Then we're locked out of the only viable growth path for the next decade. And if we pursue expansion while managing disaster recovery, then we do both. I've managed worse. When? When have you managed a territory-wide crisis and a major expansion simultaneously? Ethan slammed his hand on the desk, a crack of frustration that made Lillian flinch. I don't have the luxury of choosing one or the other. The families need recovery support or they fail. The territory needs expansion or we stagnate. Both are happening whether I'm ready or not. So you'll work yourself to death trying to do everything? If that's what it takes, yes. They stared at each other, and Lillian saw something she'd never seen in Ethan's face before. Desperation. Not the controlled concern of a man assessing problems, but raw panic of someone watching everything crumble despite his best efforts. This is what you wanted, he said, his voice low and bitter. For me to care. To see people as more than assets. Well, congratulations. I care. And it's destroying me because I can't save everyone, no matter how much I care. I never asked you to save everyone. You asked me to be different, to be better, to balance compassion with pragmatism. Well, I'm trying, and it's not working, and I don't know how to fix it. The silence that followed was heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Outside, spring rain hammered the windows. Inside, the marriage they'd been building was showing cracks of its own. I should go, Lillian said quietly. Where? Anywhere that's not here while you're like this. She left before he could respond, walking through the darkened house with her damaged feet aching and her chest tight with frustration and fear. This was what happened when you cared, when you let someone in, when you built something real instead of staying in the safety of practical arrangements. It hurt, and she had no idea how to make it stop hurting. What? The next morning brought worse news. Marcus Webb had quit, formally, publicly, in front of half the territory's workers. He'd made a speech about how Ethan Caldwell had lost his way, how sentiment had replaced sense, how the territory would collapse under weak leadership. Then he'd announced he was joining the McBride Consortium. Thomas Brennan delivered the news, looking grim. Webb took 3 other experienced hands with him. They're all signed with McBride now, working the Eastern expansion, the same expansion you were planning. Ethan's face was carved from stone. When did this happen? This morning. Webb made sure everyone knew. Said you were too busy playing house to notice your own operation falling apart. Lillian felt sick. This was her fault. Her influence, her push for change, had driven away experienced workers and given ammunition to competitors. How bad is this? She asked. Thomas looked between them. Bad. McBride's been trying to establish in Greystone for 2 years. Now he's got experienced local workers, inside knowledge of your expansion plans, and a narrative that Mr. Caldwell is distracted and weak. He's positioning himself as the alternative. Strong leadership, traditional values, no nonsense. Traditional values, Lillian repeated. Meaning what? Meaning a man's operation run by men where wives stay home and don't meddle in business. Thomas had the grace to look uncomfortable. His words, ma'am, not mine. Ethan stood abruptly. I need to assess the damage. Thomas, get me current numbers on personnel and operational capacity. I need to know exactly what we lost with Webb's departure. Yes, sir. After Thomas left, Ethan remained standing, his back to Lillian, staring at maps on the wall that showed his territory, his carefully constructed empire. Say it, he said finally. Say what? That you told me this would happen, that changing how I operated would create problems, that I should have handled Marcus differently. I wasn't going to say that. Then what were you going to say? Lillian moved closer but didn't touch him. That we'll figure it out, like we always do. There might not be anything to figure out. If McBride claims the Eastern expansion and I lose more workers to his operation, Greystone might not be viable long term. Everything I built, gone because I got soft. You're not soft. You're human. There's a difference. Not in frontier economics, there isn't. He finally turned to face her, and the exhaustion in his eyes was devastating. Maybe Marcus was right. Maybe I was better when I didn't care. More effective, stronger, and more alone. Alone worked. Alone was sustainable. This, us, caring, trying to balance everything, this is chaos. The words hit harder than Lillian expected. So what are you saying? That you want to go back to how things were? I'm saying I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be a good husband and a strong leader and keep this territory functioning all at once. Something has to give, and right now it looks like everything's giving. So you're giving up? I'm being realistic. You're panicking. They were shouting now, all the careful partnership they'd built dissolving under pressure. Rain lashed the windows. The study felt too small for the weight of their argument. You want to know what's realistic? Ethan's voice was cold now, falling back into the detached precision she'd hated in the beginning. McBride will claim the Eastern expansion. I'll lose more workers to his operation because I've shown weakness. The recovery loans will fail because half those families can't actually rebuild, and this territory will slowly collapse while I'm too busy trying to be the compassionate leader you wanted me to be. That's not fair. Fair doesn't matter. Results matter, and right now the results of your influence are catastrophic. The silence after that was absolute. Lillian felt like she'd been slapped. My influence? You asked me to change. I changed, and now I'm watching everything I built fall apart because I listened to you. So this is my fault? The flooding, Marcus quitting, McBride's expansion, all my fault because I had the audacity to suggest you treat people like human beings? I didn't say, that's exactly what you said. You're blaming me for making you care, like compassion is a weakness I infected you with. Ethan's jaw worked, and Lillian could see him fighting for control. I need to focus on saving this operation. I can't do that and manage. He gestured vaguely between them. This, whatever this is, this marriage, you mean? This distraction. The word hung there, sharp and cutting. Lillian felt something crack inside her chest. I see. Lillian, no, you're right. I've been a distraction, an inefficient complication in your otherwise orderly life. How foolish of me to think we were building something real. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. When things get hard, you retreat, back to walls and calculations and the cold efficiency that keeps you safe. She moved toward the door. You said you loved me, that I could destroy you. Turns out you were right about one thing. Destruction is definitely happening. You're just doing it to yourself. Where are you going? To my room, the one you assigned me when this was still just a practical arrangement. Seems appropriate, doesn't it? She left before he could see her cry. Walking through the house that had almost started to feel like home, but now felt like a beautiful prison. Behind her, Ethan stood alone in his study, surrounded by maps and ledgers and the ruins of his attempt to be something more than efficient. And neither of them knew how to fix what had just broken. The next 3 days were silent warfare. Ethan threw himself into damage control, working around the clock to assess the impact of Webb's defection and McBride's expansion. Lillian maintained household operations with mechanical precision, speaking to Ethan only when necessary and keeping every interaction coldly professional. They were back to being strangers who shared a house, except now it hurt worse because they knew what they were missing. Mrs. Henderson watched it all with disapproving silence. Sarah Collins asked tentatively if everything was all right when Lillian visited to check on the new baby. Even Thomas Brennan looked uncomfortable when he delivered reports to a study where Ethan sat alone, Lillian conspicuously absent. The territory noticed. Of course they noticed. In a place this small, everything was noticed. And the whispers started. Mrs. Caldwell and her husband weren't speaking. The marriage was failing. Maybe Marcus Webb had been right about sentiment-weakening leadership. Lillian heard the whispers but didn't care. She was too angry, too hurt, too aware that she'd opened herself up to someone who'd thrown it back in her face the moment things got difficult. On the 4th day, she made a decision. She'd been visiting the flood damage section regularly, checking on families, assessing recovery progress. The work gave her something to focus on besides the disaster of her marriage. And she'd noticed something, a pattern Ethan had missed in his exhaustion. The contaminated wells weren't random. They followed a specific line through the southern section, all drawing from the same underground water source. If that source could be identified and treated, all the wells could be salvaged simultaneously instead of individually. It would require specialized knowledge, geological survey, water testing, treatment planning. Knowledge she didn't have, but she knew someone who might. Samuel Roth was a hydrologist who'd worked in the territory 3 years ago, helping Ethan design the original well system. He'd left for better opportunities in the city, but he'd been good at his work. Brilliant, actually. And he'd made it clear during those 3 years that he found Lillian interesting. Nothing inappropriate. She'd been unmarried then, and he'd been respectful. But the attraction had been obvious. When he'd left, he'd told her if she ever needed anything, she could write. She'd never written. Until now. The letter was professional, explained the contamination problem, offered consulting fees. Mentioned nothing personal. But she knew what it would look like if Samuel Roth returned to Greystone at her invitation, with her husband barely speaking to her and the territory already whispering about marital problems. She sent the letter anyway, because the wells needed fixing, and she was done waiting for Ethan to notice problems beyond his own wounded pride. Samuel arrived 10 days later, and he looked exactly as Lillian remembered. Tall, sandy-haired, with the easy confidence of a man who knew his expertise was valuable. Mrs. Caldwell, he greeted her warmly, clasping her hand a moment too long to be purely professional. You're looking well. Thank you for coming on short notice. For you, I'd have come on no notice at all. They were standing in front of the Caldwell house, and Lillian was acutely aware of Ethan watching from his study window. She pulled her hand back gently. The contamination maps are inside. I can show you. Lillian. She turned to find Ethan approaching, his expression carved from ice. He acknowledged Samuel with the barest nod. Mr. Roth. I wasn't aware we'd hired external consultants.
You hadn't, Lillian said evenly. I did. The well contamination needs specialized expertise, and Mr. Roth worked on the original system. He's qualified. I see. Ethan's tone could have frozen water. And you made this decision without consulting me because you've been too busy blaming me for the territory's problems to actually solve them. Samuel looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. Perhaps I should come back at a better time. No, Lillian said firmly. You're here now. Let me show you the contamination data. She led Samuel inside, leaving Ethan standing in the yard with clenched fists and an expression that promised this conversation wasn't over. The explosion came that evening. Ethan waited until Samuel had left for his lodgings in town, then appeared in Lillian's doorway like a storm given human form. What the hell do you think you're doing? Lillian didn't look up from her book. Solving problems. You should try it sometime. You hired your former suitor to work on my territory without my approval. He's a hydrologist, not a suitor, and I used household funds, which you gave me discretion over. I'm within my authority. This isn't about authority. This is about you deliberately. He stopped, visibly struggling for control. Everyone in town is talking about how Mrs. Caldwell brought in a handsome specialist while her marriage is falling apart. Then maybe you should have fixed the wells yourself instead of sulking in your study for a week. I wasn't sulking. I was trying to save our operation. By pushing away everyone who cares about you, brilliant strategy. Ethan stepped into the room, and Lillian finally set down her book. They faced each other like combatants, all the progress they'd made completely eroded. You want to hurt me, Ethan said quietly. Because I hurt you. So you brought in a man who wants you, who'll work closely with you for weeks, who'll give the entire territory ammunition to question our marriage. I brought in someone qualified to solve a critical problem. If that embarrasses you, that's your issue, not mine. Don't lie to me, Lillian. You knew exactly what this would look like. And you knew exactly what it would feel like when you called me a distraction, when you blamed me for every problem facing this territory, when you took back every vulnerable thing you'd said because caring got difficult. Her voice was rising, all the hurt she'd been containing spilling out. So yes, maybe I wanted you to feel something other than cold calculation for once. Maybe I wanted you to remember that I exist as more than a convenient scapegoat for your failures. My failures? Yes, your failures. Marcus quit because you can't manage personnel relationships. McBride is expanding because you're too proud to form alliances. The recovery is struggling because you spread yourself too thin trying to control everything. None of that is my fault, Ethan. That's all you. The silence that followed was devastating. Ethan looked like she'd physically struck him. His face was pale, his hands shaking slightly. Get out, he said quietly. What? Get out of this house, tonight. I don't care where you go. Town, the Henderson cabin, hell, Samuel Roth's lodgings for all I care. Just get out. Lillian felt the floor drop out from under her. You're throwing me out? I'm ending this. Whatever this is, I can't do it anymore. The fighting, the blame, the constant feeling that I'm failing at everything. You were right from the beginning. This marriage was a mistake. We should have kept it practical. You don't mean that. I absolutely mean it. His voice was dead calm now, empty of everything. I'll have Mrs. Henderson pack your things. We'll handle the legal dissolution quietly. You'll be financially provided for. I'm not cruel. But I can't have you here, undermining my authority and reminding me daily that I'm not the man you wanted me to be. Ethan, leave, please. The please broke her. Lillian grabbed her coat with shaking hands and left the room, left the house, left everything she'd tried to build in Greystone territory. The rain had returned, cold spring rain that soaked through her coat immediately. She walked without direction, her damaged feet screaming in protest, her chest so tight she could barely breathe. She'd destroyed it, destroyed everything. She'd pushed too hard, wanted too much, expected a man who'd spent his entire life behind walls to tear them down overnight. And now she had nothing. She ended up at Sarah Collins's homestead, soaked and shaking and barely able to speak. Sarah took one look at her and pulled her inside without questions, wrapped her in blankets, made tea that Lillian couldn't taste. What happened? Sarah asked gently. My marriage just ended. Oh, honey.
Lillian told her everything, the fight about Samuel, Ethan's accusation, the way he'd looked at her like she was a stranger again. Sarah listened, holding Lillian's cold hands, her expression growing increasingly troubled. Mrs. Caldwell, Lillian, can I tell you something that might not be what you want to hear? Could it possibly be worse than what I'm feeling? Maybe. Sarah took a breath. You're both wrong. Both so wrong I don't even know where to start. Lillian blinked. What? Mr. Caldwell is wrong for panicking and pushing you away when things got hard, for blaming you instead of working with you, for being too proud to admit he's overwhelmed. Sarah squeezed her hands. But you're wrong too, for bringing Samuel Roth here knowing exactly what it would look like, for fighting hurt with hurt, for expecting Mr. Caldwell to be perfect at something he's never done before. I didn't expect perfect. You kind of did, though. You expected him to transform from closed off to vulnerable, from rigid to flexible, from controlling to collaborative, all while managing a territory crisis. That's a lot to ask of anyone, let alone a man who's spent his whole life believing emotion is weakness. But he was changing. He was trying, and then he stumbled, and you punished him for it instead of helping him up. Sarah's voice was kind but firm. Marriage isn't about keeping score. It's not about who hurt who worse or who's right. It's about choosing each other even when everything's falling apart. He told me to leave. And you left. You didn't fight to stay. You just accepted his worst moment as truth and walked away. Lillian started crying, ugly, gasping sobs that shook her whole body. Sarah held her, rocking slightly, making the soft, soothing sounds mothers make to crying children. What do I do? Lillian whispered. You go back. You tell him you were wrong about Samuel. You tell him you're scared too. You stop trying to win arguments and start trying to save your marriage. Sarah pulled back to look at her. But Lillian, you have to decide if you actually want to save it. Because if you go back, you have to commit to the messy, imperfect, frustrating work of building something real with an imperfect man. If you can't do that, if you need him to be someone he's not, then maybe you should stay gone. The truth of it settled over Lillian like weight. Did she want Ethan as he actually was? Difficult, stubborn, emotionally constipated, brilliant, trying so hard despite having no idea how? Or did she want some idealized version she'd built in her head? The man he could be if he just tried harder, changed faster, got it right. I want him, she said quietly. The real him, even when he's impossible. Then go tell him that, before you both do more damage. Lillian walked back through the rain, her feet screaming, her heart pounding. The house was dark except for one light, Ethan's study. She found him there, sitting in the chair she'd occupied during her recovery, holding the photograph of her parents that had been on her desk upstairs. He looked up when she entered, and his eyes were red. You came back, he said hoarsely. I shouldn't have left. I shouldn't have told you to go. They stared at each other across the study, both soaked in different ways, her from rain, him from crying. I'm sorry, Lillian said. About Samuel. About fighting hurt with hurt. About expecting you to be perfect at something you've never done before. I'm sorry for panicking, for blaming you, for being too proud to admit I'm terrified of losing you. He set down the photograph carefully. I've been sitting here trying to figure out how to apologize, how to ask you to come back, how to fix this. And all I could think was that I don't deserve another chance. Neither of us deserves one, but maybe we give each other chances anyway. Ethan stood, moved toward her but stopped a few feet away, like he was afraid to touch her. I don't know how to do this, Lillian. I keep trying and failing and hurting you in the process. Maybe you'd be better off. Don't, she interrupted. Don't decide what's better for me. I'm choosing you. Messy, imperfect, struggling you. But I need you to choose me back. Actually choose me. Not the idea of a wife, not the partnership that makes sense on paper. Me. I do choose you. I have been choosing you. I'm just terrible at showing it. Then learn. We'll both learn. Together. He crossed the remaining distance and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. She wrapped her arms around him and felt his whole body shaking. I love you, he said against her hair. Even when I'm horrible at it. Even when everything's falling apart. I love you. I love you too. even when you're impossible. They stood there in the study, holding each other like the world was ending. And maybe it was. Maybe their old world, their old ways of being, had to end so something new could grow. Outside, the rain continued. Inside, two imperfect people were trying to build something real from the ruins of their mistakes. And then the door burst open and Thomas Brennan stood there, soaked and frantic. "Mr. Caldwell, there's been an accident. The southern bridge, the flooding undermined the supports and it collapsed. There's a wagon in the river. People trapped." Ethan pulled away from Lillian instantly, his face going cold and focused. "How many?" "At least 3 families. Maybe more. They were trying to cross for tonight's gathering." "Get every able rider. I want rescue teams assembled in 10 minutes." Thomas nodded and ran. Ethan grabbed his coat, already moving toward the door. Lillian caught his arm. "I'm coming with you." "Lillian, your feet are fine. You need everyone. I'm coming." He looked at her, really looked at her, and nodded. "Stay behind the rescue line. Promise me." "I promise." They ran into the storm together, toward disaster and danger, and the kind of crisis that would test everything they'd just rebuilt. The river was chaos, dark water churning with debris, the collapsed bridge jutting from the current like broken bones. Lanterns illuminated the scene in flashes, showing the overturned wagon caught on bridge wreckage, people clinging to wood, children screaming. "3 families confirmed," Thomas shouted over the roar of water. "The Mackenzies, Hendersons, and Porters, at least 2 children in the water. Daniel Mackenzie, the drunk Ethan had refused to fully support, the Henderson family that had served the Caldwell house for decades. All of them trapped because of a bridge Ethan's operation had maintained. Ethan assessed the situation with terrifying speed. "We can't get boats in that current. We need rope lines from both banks. Thomas, organize teams on the north side. Marcus," he stopped. Marcus was gone. "I'll do it," Lillian said. "No, I know what to do. I've watched you manage crisis operations for months. Trust me." Ethan looked at her, and in that moment, everything they'd been through crystallized. The arguments, the hurt, the tentative rebuilding. He had to choose to actually trust her. "Go," he said. Lillian ran to the south bank, organizing volunteers, setting up rope lines, coordinating rescue attempts with systematic efficiency that would have made Ethan proud. The first rescue was successful. John Henderson, pulled from the wagon, coughing water but alive. The second went wrong. A child, maybe 7 years old, one of the Mackenzie girls, lost her grip on the wagon. The current caught her, swept her downstream faster than anyone expected. Without thinking, Lillian grabbed the rescue rope and plunged into the river. The cold was shocking, the current stronger than she'd anticipated. Her damaged feet provided no purchase on the rocky bottom, but she could see the child ahead, struggling, going under. Lillian lunged forward, caught the girl's dress, pulled her close. "I've got you!" The child clung to her, sobbing. Lillian tried to signal the rope team, but the current spun them, disorienting her. Which way was shore? Where was... She hit the collapsed bridge support with stunning force. Pain exploded through her ribs. Her grip on the rope loosened. The last thing she saw before the water pulled her under was Ethan diving in, reaching for her, his face twisted in terror. Then everything went dark. Lillian surfaced gasping, the child still clutched against her chest. Her ribs screamed where she'd hit the bridge support. The rope. She'd lost the rope. Current pulled at them both, relentless and cold. Strong hands grabbed her shoulders. Ethan, his face inches from hers, eyes wild with fear and determination. "I've got you," he shouted over the roar of water. "Don't let go of her!" He pulled them both toward the shore, fighting current that wanted to drag them downstream. Lillian kicked with her damaged feet, ignoring the pain, focused only on keeping the child's head above water. They hit the shallows hard. Hands reached for them. Thomas, Robert Collins, men whose names Lillian didn't know, but whose strength pulled them from the river onto muddy bank. The child was ripped from Lillian's arms. Someone was checking her breathing, wrapping her in blankets. Lillian tried to stand to see if the girl was alive, but her legs wouldn't hold. Ethan caught her before she fell, lowered her carefully to the ground. His hands were shaking as he checked her for injuries. "Your ribs!" "The child," Lillian gasped. "Is she breathing? She's breathing." His voice cracked.
What the hell were you thinking? You promised to stay behind the rescue line. She was drowning. So you decided to drown with her? I decided to save her. They stared at each other, both soaked and shaking, and despite everything, the danger, the pain, the absolute insanity of what had just happened, Ethan started laughing. Broken, exhausted laughter that sounded half mad. You're going to kill me, he said. Not the territory, not McBride, not any of it. You. You're going to stop my heart one of these days. Probably, Lillian agreed, and then she was laughing too, because what else could you do when you just survived drowning and your husband looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes? Dr. Patterson arrived, checked them both over with brisk efficiency. 3 cracked ribs for Lillian, mild hypothermia for both of them. The Mackenzie girl had swallowed water but would recover. All families from the collapsed wagon had been pulled from the river alive. Miracle, someone murmured. Luck, someone else corrected. Lillian Caldwell, a third voice said with certainty. The rescue had taken 4 hours. By the time everyone was accounted for, treated, and settled in temporary shelter at the trading post, dawn was breaking over Greystone territory. Ethan and Lillian sat on the trading post steps, wrapped in borrowed blankets, watching the sky lighten. Neither of them had the energy to move. You saved that child, Ethan said quietly. We saved her. You dove in after me. After you dove in first, ignoring every safety protocol. I had a rope, which you lost. Details. Ethan turned to look at her. You could have died. Again. For the second time in 3 months, I watched you nearly die trying to save people. And for the second time, you came after me. Of course I came after you. What was I supposed to do? Let you drown? You could have. Would have been efficient. No more messy emotions complicating your operation. Don't. His voice was rough. Don't joke about that. Not after tonight. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder, immediately regretting it when her ribs protested. Sorry. Stop risking yourself. Stop giving me reasons to. They sat in silence as the territory began to wake. People emerged from temporary shelters, checking on loved ones, assessing damage, and they noticed the Caldwells on the steps, soaked, exhausted, sitting together like they were the only solid thing in a world that had tried to wash them away. Daniel Mackenzie approached slowly. He looked sober for the first time Lillian had ever seen him, his face drawn with something that might have been shame. Mr. Caldwell? Mrs. Caldwell. He twisted his hat in his hands. My daughter, Emma. She's the one Mrs. Caldwell pulled from the river. Dr. Patterson says she'll be fine because your wife got to her so fast. Ethan nodded stiffly. I'm glad she's safe. I wanted to say... Daniel stopped, swallowed hard. I've been a bastard to my family, to this territory. I know what people say about me, and they're right. But my Emma's alive because Mrs. Caldwell didn't give up on her. Didn't decide she wasn't worth saving because her father's a drunk. Mr. Mackenzie, let me finish. Please. Daniel's eyes were red. I'm done drinking. Starting today. My wife deserves better. My kids deserve better. And I owe it to Mrs. Caldwell to be the kind of man whose daughter is worth nearly dying for. He looked at Lillian directly. Thank you, ma'am, for seeing Emma instead of me, for saving her anyway. He left before either of them could respond, walking back to his family with shoulders that seemed straighter than before. Lillian felt tears on her cheeks, exhaustion and pain and something bigger she couldn't name. Did that just happen? She whispered. I think so. Daniel Mackenzie is going to stop drinking. Maybe. Because I jumped in a river. Because you showed him his daughter was worth saving. Ethan pulled her closer, careful of her ribs. You show everyone they're worth saving. That's your gift. I manage systems. You save people. We're supposed to do it together. I'm learning, slowly, very slowly, but I'm learning. Sarah Collins appeared with coffee and bread, sitting beside them without invitation. You two look terrible. We nearly drowned, Lillian said. I heard. Everyone heard. It's all anyone can talk about. Mrs. Caldwell diving into a flood to save Daniel Mackenzie's daughter, while Mr. Caldwell dove in to save Mrs. Caldwell. Sarah handed them the coffee. Very romantic. Extremely stupid. But romantic. I keep telling her to stop risking herself, Ethan said. And I keep telling him some things are worth the risk, Lillian countered.
Sarah smiled. You two worked it out then? The fight? We're trying to, Lillian said. One crisis at a time, apparently. That's marriage in Greystone, crisis management with occasional kissing. Sarah stood. Get some rest, both of you. The territory will survive a few hours without constant supervision. After she left, Ethan helped Lillian to her feet. They walked back to the house slowly, supporting each other, covered in river mud and exhaustion. Mrs. Henderson met them at the door, took one look at them, and started giving orders like a general commanding troops. Mr. Caldwell, you help your wife upstairs. I'll draw a hot bath. Then you're both sleeping for at least 6 hours, or I'm locking you in your rooms myself. Yes, ma'am, Ethan said meekly. They made it upstairs, where Mrs. Henderson had indeed drawn a bath in Lillian's room. The housekeeper helped Lillian out of her sodden clothes while Ethan waited outside, then left with strict instructions about rest and recovery. Lillian sank into the hot water with a groan. Everything hurt. Ribs, feet, muscles she'd forgotten existed. But she was alive. The child was alive. They'd survived another disaster. A soft knock on the bathroom door. Can I come in? Ethan's voice. Yes. He entered, still in his wet clothes, and sat on the floor beside the tub. Not looking at her, propriety still mattered to him, just being close. I thought I lost you, he said quietly. When you went under, when I couldn't reach you fast enough, I thought... His voice broke. Lillian reached out, found his hand, held it tight. I'm here. You keep almost not being here, and I keep realizing how much that would destroy me. So we're even. You terrify me too. How do I terrify you? By being willing to give up on us when things get hard, by retreating into walls I can't reach through. She squeezed his hand. I'm not afraid of drowning, Ethan. I'm afraid of losing you to your own fear. He was quiet for a long moment. I don't know how to not be afraid. I've spent my whole life controlling things to prevent loss. You're asking me to just let go. Trust that we'll survive without complete control. That's harder than diving into any river. I know. But you did dive into the river. For me. Even though it was terrifying and dangerous and completely out of your control. That was different. How? Because losing you isn't acceptable. So I don't get to be afraid. I just act. Lillian turned to look at him properly, ignoring her ribs' protest. That's what I need from you, not perfection, not flawless emotional availability. Just you being willing to act even when you're afraid. To choose us, even when it's hard. Ethan met her eyes finally. I can do that. I might fail sometimes. Panic and retreat and hurt you in the process. But I can keep choosing you, even when I'm terrified. Then that's enough. He leaned forward, kissed her gently. I love you. Imperfectly. Fearfully. But completely. I love you too. Now get out so I can finish bathing. You smell like river mud. He laughed and left her alone. Lillian sank deeper into the hot water and let herself feel, for just a moment, like maybe they were going to be okay. Maybe. The next morning brought complications. Word of the rescue had spread beyond Greystone. By noon, a rider arrived from the territorial governor's office with an official commendation for heroic action during disaster relief. By evening, Samuel Roth appeared at the Caldwell house with news. The contaminated wells, he said, spreading maps across Ethan's desk. I've identified the source. Underground spring feeding the entire southern well network. It's treatable. We can filter at the source point and restore all wells simultaneously. How long? Ethan asked. 2 weeks of work. Maybe 3. But Mr. Caldwell... Samuel hesitated. I need to tell you something. McBride's consortium approached me yesterday. Offered me 3 times what Mrs. Caldwell is paying if I delayed my findings. Gave them time to establish water rights while your territory struggled. The study went very quiet. And you're telling me this because... Ethan's voice was dangerously calm. Because I turned them down. Because what Mrs. Caldwell is doing here, the way she approaches problems, sees people, builds community, that matters more than McBride's money. Samuel looked at Lillian. You dove into a flood to save a child whose father most people had written off. That's the kind of territory I want to support. Not McBride's efficient exploitation. Ethan stood, walked around his desk, and extended his hand to Samuel. "Thank you for your honesty and your integrity." They shook, and something shifted in Ethan's expression, a decision being made. "Mr. Roth, I'd like to offer you a permanent position. Chief Water Engineer for Greystone Territory. You'd oversee all well operations, expansion planning, and disaster response. Salary and terms negotiable, but competitive with anything McBride offered." Samuel blinked. I'd need to think. "Of course. Take your time. The offer stands." After Samuel left, looking dazed, Lillian turned to Ethan. "That was unexpected. That was strategic. Roth is brilliant, and having him working for us instead of against us changes the water rights situation completely. Plus," he paused, "he respects you, respects what you're building here. I need people like that, people who see value in what we're doing together. Not people who just follow orders. Not anymore. That's the old way. This, he gestured vaguely. Whatever this new way is, it requires different people. It requires trust. Yes, which is terrifying, but apparently I'm learning to act while terrified." He smiled slightly. "You're a bad influence." "The worst." They were interrupted by Thomas Brennan, looking agitated. "Mr. Caldwell, there's a situation. Marcus Webb is at the trading post, says he needs to speak with you. Won't say about what, but he looks rough." Ethan and Lillian exchanged glances. "Tell him I'll be there in 10 minutes. They found Marcus standing outside the trading post, and Thomas was right. He looked terrible. Thinner than 3 weeks ago, exhausted, his usual arrogance completely absent. "Mr. Caldwell. Mrs. Caldwell." Marcus's voice was hoarse. "Thank you for seeing me." "What do you want, Marcus?" Ethan's tone was neutral, giving nothing away. "To apologize. And to warn you." Marcus took a breath. "McBride's consortium is worse than you know. I left because I was angry because I thought you'd gone soft and I could do better elsewhere. I was wrong. McBride doesn't want to develop the territory. He wants to strip it. Minimum investment, maximum extraction, no thought for sustainability." "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I spent 2 weeks watching him work, saw how he treats people, saw his actual plans for the eastern expansion." Marcus pulled out folded papers. Water diversion that would drain the Crow River Basin within 5 years. Soil exploitation that would make the land useless for a generation. He's not building anything. He's consuming. Ethan took the papers, scanned them quickly. His expression darkened. "This is legal, unfortunately. Aggressive, but legal. And if he claims those water rights, there's nothing you can do to stop him." Marcus looked at Lillian. "I heard what you did during the flood, saving Mackenzie's daughter. Everyone's talking about it. Not just here, but in every settlement within 3 days' ride. They're saying Mrs. Caldwell risked her life while her husband dove in after her. That the Caldwells don't just manage the territory, they care about it. And?" Ethan's voice was carefully controlled. "And that matters. McBride's offering efficiency and profit. You're offering community. In the short term, efficiency wins. But long term..." Marcus paused. "I was wrong. About a lot of things. You haven't gone soft. You've gotten stronger in ways I didn't understand." "Are you asking for your job back?" "No, sir. I burned that bridge. I'm asking if there's anything I can do to help stop McBride. Information I have, contacts he's made, weaknesses in his operation. I'll give you everything if you'll use it." Ethan studied his former foreman, the man who'd publicly questioned his leadership, who'd defected to his competitor, who was now standing here offering intelligence with nothing to gain. "Why the change of heart?" "Because I watched McBride laugh about how the flood would weaken your operation, make people desperate enough to accept his terms, and all I could think was, Mr. Caldwell would have been organizing rescue teams, would have been in that river himself if necessary. McBride saw disaster as opportunity. You see it as responsibility." Marcus's jaw tightened. "I picked the wrong side. I'd like to correct that if you'll let me." Lillian watched Ethan process this, the strategic value of Marcus's intelligence balanced against the betrayal of his defection. Old Ethan would have calculated the advantage and taken it without acknowledging the human dimension. New Ethan, the one still learning, had to navigate both. "You can help," Ethan said finally, "but not as an employee. As an independent contractor. You provide intelligence. I pay fair rates. We work together on stopping McBride's exploitation. But the trust that was broken, That takes time to rebuild. Marcus nodded. That's more than fair. Thank you, Mr. Caldwell. Thank my wife. She's the one who keeps insisting people deserve second chances. After Marcus left, Ethan turned to Lillian. Was that the right call? I don't know. But it was a human call. You saw potential for redemption instead of just calculating advantage. That's growth. Or weakness that will come back to hurt us. Maybe both. Welcome to operating without complete control. They spent the rest of the day going through Marcus's intelligence. The picture that emerged was damning. McBride's consortium had been planning Greystone's exploitation for over a year. The well contamination, the flood timing, even Marcus's defection had all been opportunities McBride had positioned himself to exploit. He's been playing a longer game than I realized, Ethan admitted. While I was focused on immediate operations, he was setting up dominoes. So we knocked down his dominoes before he can tip them. How? He's already claimed preliminary rights on the eastern expansion. If he gets final approval from the territorial governor, then we make sure he doesn't get final approval. Lillian, you can't just stop. Listen to me. She spread out her own maps, sketches she'd been making during recovery, notes from conversations with families, observations from her travels through the territory. McBride's selling efficiency. We sell community. He's telling the governor that Greystone needs strong external development. We show the governor that Greystone is already developing itself. With what evidence? With everything we've done. The flood recovery that saved lives. The well restoration that's happening faster than projected. The families who are rebuilding because we gave them support instead of writing them off. Daniel Mackenzie sobering up. The Hendersons expanding their operation. The Collins farm becoming profitable. She looked at him. We document it all. Present it as proof that Greystone doesn't need McBride's exploitation. It needs continued support for the community that's already thriving. Awesome, pato. Ethan stared at her maps, her notes, the evidence of everything that had changed in the past 6 months. This could work, he said slowly. It has to work, because the alternative is watching McBride destroy everything we've built. They worked through the night, assembling documentation. By morning, they had a proposal, comprehensive, detailed, showing Greystone territory not as a failing frontier operation needing external salvation, but as a developing community requiring continued support. I'll take this to the territorial governor myself, Ethan said. Request formal hearing before final water rights are granted. We'll take it, Lillian corrected. Together. You handle the logistics and economics. I handle the human dimension. We show him the complete picture. The governor's office is 4 days' travel. Your ribs are healing. I'm coming. Lillian. We're partners, remember? Equal input. That means equal representation when we're fighting for our territory's future. Ethan looked at her, this woman who kept diving into rivers literal and metaphorical, who refused to let him face anything alone, who'd somehow become the foundation of everything he was building. Okay, he said. We go together. They left the next morning, taking Thomas Brennan and Sarah Collins as witnesses, people who could speak to the territory's transformation from personal experience. The journey was hard on Lillian's healing body, but she didn't complain, just kept moving forward with the same stubborn determination that had saved a drowning child. The territorial governor's mansion was impressive. 2 stories of imported timber, glass windows that must have cost a fortune. Gardens that looked absurd in frontier country. The kind of place that announced power and civilization. They were kept waiting 2 hours before being admitted to Governor Harrison's office. Harrison was a man in his 50s, well-dressed, with the soft hands of someone who'd never worked a field or managed livestock. He looked at them with polite disinterest. Mr. Caldwell, I wasn't expecting you. I'm requesting formal hearing before final water rights approval on the eastern expansion. The McBride petition? That's nearly finalized. The consortium has presented compelling arguments for infrastructure development. With respect, Governor, the consortium has presented arguments for resource extraction. I'd like to present an alternative. Harrison sighed like the man whose schedule had just become inconvenient. Very well. You have 30 minutes. Ethan presented the logistics, recovery rates, infrastructure improvements, economic projections, solid, factual, impossible to argue with. Harrison listened with the expression of a man who'd heard similar pitches before. Then Lillian stood. Governor Harrison, may I show you something? She spread photographs across his desk, images they'd had a traveling photographer capture over the past weeks. The Collins family in front of their rebuilt homestead. Baby Lillian in Sarah's arms. Daniel Mackenzie standing sober beside his daughter Emma, both smiling. The Henderson operation expanded and thriving. Families working together on flood recovery, helping each other rebuild. These are the people who make Greystone territory work, Lillian said quietly. Not systems and infrastructure, though those matter. Not efficient resource extraction, though productivity matters. People. Families who've chosen to build lives in brutal conditions because they believe this place can be home. Mrs. Caldwell, I appreciate the sentiment, but policy isn't made on feelings. This isn't about feelings. It's about sustainability. She pulled out more documentation. Mr. McBride's projections show 5 years of maximum profit extraction. Our projections show 20 years of steady growth. His model depletes resources and moves on. Ours builds community that lasts. Which serves the territory's long-term interests better? Harrison actually looked interested now. You have economic projections backing this? Comprehensive analysis, Ethan said, handing over their detailed proposal, including comparative studies of similar development models in other territories. Short-term extraction consistently leads to long-term collapse. Sustainable community development creates stable economic foundations. The governor read through their proposal in silence. Lillian could see him reassessing, not just the water rights petition, but them. The Caldwells weren't the rigid administrator and decorative wife he'd expected. They were actual partners presenting a unified vision. This is impressive work, Harrison said finally. More thorough than McBride's submission, frankly. But the consortium has significant financial backing, political influence. They're offering immediate infrastructure investment that Greystone desperately needs. We're offering something better, Lillian said. Proof that Greystone doesn't need external salvation. It needs support for what it's already building. She gestured to Sarah and Thomas. These are witnesses who can speak to the transformation happening in Greystone. Not theoretical projections, actual lived experience. Harrison listened as Sarah described how the recovery loans had saved her family. As Thomas explained how collaborative infrastructure development was outperforming the old top-down model. As both testified to how the territory's character had shifted from survival to actual community. When they finished, Harrison sat back in his chair, looking thoughtful. I'm going to be honest with you, Mr. Caldwell. When I heard about your marriage, the rumor was you'd acquired a wife for water rights purposes, political maneuvering disguised as matrimony. That was the original arrangement, yes, Ethan said carefully. But that's not what I'm seeing now. What I'm seeing is actual partnership. Complementary strengths working toward shared vision. Harrison smiled slightly. It's rare, especially out here, where most marriages are practical arrangements at best. We started as a practical arrangement, Lillian said. But we're trying to build something more real, same with the territory. It started as isolated homesteads managed by efficient systems. We're trying to build actual community. And you believe this community model will outperform McBride's extraction approach? I know it will, Ethan said, because we've already seen it work. The flood recovery, the well restoration, the families who are thriving because we invested in their potential instead of writing them off as acceptable losses. That's not theoretical, it's proven. Harrison was quiet for a long moment, reviewing their proposal again. I'm going to delay final approval on the water rights, he said finally. Give your community development model 6 months to demonstrate sustained viability. If your projections hold, if Greystone continues the growth trajectory you've documented, I'll grant you the Eastern expansion rights instead of McBride. And if our projections don't hold, Ethan asked, then McBride gets his petition approved and you'll have 6 months to prepare for his arrival. Harrison stood, extended his hand. But based on what I've seen today, the work you've done, the partnership you've demonstrated, the actual results you've achieved, I believe you'll succeed. Greystone is lucky to have you both. They shook hands, collected their materials, and left the governor's mansion in stunned silence. They'd won. Not completely. 6 months of proving themselves was its own challenge. But they'd stopped McBride's immediate takeover and bought time to build what they'd started. They made it to their wagon before Ethan pulled Lillian into his arms, holding her tight despite her cracked ribs protesting. We did it, he said against her hair. We did. Together. Yes. He pulled back to look at her. I couldn't have done this alone. Not just today. Any of it. The governor was right. What we have, this partnership, it's what made the difference. We're good at different things, Lillian said. You build systems. I build relationships. Together, we build community. I love you, Ethan said. Imperfectly, but completely. Thank you for not giving up on me when I was being impossible. Thank you for learning to jump into rivers. They kissed, right there in front of the governor's mansion, and neither of them cared who saw. The journey back to Greystone took 4 days. When they arrived, the territory was waiting. Word had spread somehow that the Caldwells had gone to fight for their future. People lined the main road, families standing in front of homesteads, workers pausing in fields. Not cheering, that wasn't the frontier way. Just watching, waiting to know if they'd won or lost. Ethan stood in the wagon, raised his voice to Carrie. We have 6 months to prove Greystone can sustain itself. 6 months to show that community matters more than extraction. Can we do it? The response was immediate. Hands raising, voices calling agreement, people nodding with the kind of determination that came from knowing exactly what they were fighting for. Then let's get to work, Ethan said simply. That night, lying in bed together, in Ethan's room this time, the distance between their separate quarters finally closed. They talked about the future. 6 months isn't much time, Lillian said. No, but it's enough if we're smart about it. And if we're not? Then we'll figure something out. We always do. She turned to look at him in the darkness. When did you become the optimist? When I married a woman who keeps jumping into rivers and expecting to survive. Your reckless hope is contagious. My strategic courage, you mean? Sure. Let's call it that. They lay in comfortable silence, listening to the territory settle into night. Somewhere out there, families were rebuilding, wells were being restored. Community was growing from the ruins of isolated survival. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't easy, but it was real. And they'd built it together. One difficult choice at a time, one crisis survived, one leap of faith after another. Ethan? I'm glad I married you. For the property rights? For you. The impossible, stubborn, slowly learning to be human you. He pulled her closer, careful of her ribs. I'm glad I married you too, for all the reasons I didn't understand at the time and am still figuring out. Outside, Greystone territory dreamed of futures they were building together, and inside, 2 people who'd married for every wrong reason had found every right one. 6 months to prove themselves. They'd survived worse. Together they could survive anything. Together, they could survive anything. The next morning proved that theory immediately. Lillian woke to find Ethan already gone, a note on his pillow. Eastern fields, problem with irrigation, back by noon. She dressed carefully, her ribs still tender, and found Mrs. Henderson in the kitchen looking worried. What's wrong? Mr. Mackenzie came by at dawn. Said there's trouble brewing. Some of the northern homesteaders, the ones who sided with Marcus originally, they're saying the governor's decision proves Mr. Caldwell is weak, that he needed his wife to win the hearing because he couldn't do it himself. Lillian set down her coffee cup slowly. Who's saying this? James Porter mainly. He's got 5 other families agreeing with him. They're talking about accepting McBride's offer to buy them out. Say they'd rather work for strong leadership than watch Greystone collapse under sentiment. McBride's still making offers? Apparently he's not giving up. Figures if he can't get the water rights, he can at least acquire enough land to control the territory anyway. Lillian felt cold settle in her stomach. 6 months to prove themselves, and they were already fracturing from within. She found Thomas Brennan at the trading post, confirmed what Mrs. Henderson had said. Porter and his allies were meeting that afternoon to discuss McBride's buyout offer. Can you stop them? Thomas asked. I don't know, but I'm going to try. She rode out to the northern section alone, ignoring the protest from her healing body. The Porter homestead sat on good land, 40 acres that James Porter had worked for 8 years. His wife Margaret met Lillian at the door, looking uncomfortable. Mrs. Caldwell, I didn't expect... I heard about the meeting. I'd like to attend. Margaret hesitated. James won't like that. I'm not asking James's permission. I'm asking yours. Something shifted in Margaret's expression, recognition passing between women who understood what it meant to have opinions that mattered. She stepped aside. Come in. The meeting was already underway, 6 men sitting around the Porter kitchen table discussing McBride's offer like it was a done deal. James Porter looked up when Lillian entered, his face darkening. "This is a private meeting, Mrs. Caldwell. About selling land in the territory my husband manages. That makes it my business. Your husband, not you." James stood. "With all respect, ma'am, this is men's business. We're making hard decisions about our family's futures. We don't need a woman's sentiment complicating things." Lillian stayed calm, though anger simmered under her skin. "Is that what you think I represent? Sentiment? I think you represent the reason Greystone's struggling. Mr. Caldwell was strong before you got involved. Now he's soft, making decisions based on feelings instead of facts." Interesting, because the facts show that recovery rates are up 40% since we implemented community-based support. The families who received flexible assistance are outperforming those who didn't. That the territory's economic stability has improved, not declined, under the new model. She pulled out documentation from her satchel, the same data they'd shown the governor. "These are facts, Mr. Porter, not sentiment. Numbers can be made to show anything. Can they? Then explain why the Collins farm is profitable for the first time in 3 years. Why the Henderson operation expanded. Why Daniel Mackenzie is sober and his family is thriving. Are those numbers lying?" Another man spoke up. Henry Chen. "Mrs. Caldwell, we appreciate what you've done, but McBride's offering real money, guaranteed employment, security we can't get from promises about community. You're right, promises aren't enough. So let me show you what you're actually choosing between." Lillian spread out more documents, McBride's actual development plans that Marcus had provided. "This is what McBride does to territories: 5 years of maximum extraction, then abandonment. The families he employs work under contract conditions that amount to indentured servitude. The land he develops becomes unusable within a decade." That's speculation. It's documented history from 3 other territories. Marcus Webb can verify. He saw McBride's operation firsthand. Is that who you want controlling your land, your children's futures? James crossed his arms. "Better than watching Greystone fail because your husband can't make hard decisions anymore. My husband makes harder decisions now than he ever did before. The difference is he makes them while seeing the people they affect as human beings, not assets. That's not weakness. That's actual leadership. Leadership is strength. Leadership is responsibility. And right now you're avoiding yours." Lillian looked at each man in turn. "You built these homesteads from nothing, survived winters that killed others, worked land that fought you every step. You did that through strength, yes, but also through community, through neighbors helping neighbors, through choosing to build something instead of just surviving. Pretty words won't keep us fed. No, work keeps you fed. Smart choices keep you fed. And selling to McBride is the opposite of a smart choice." She pointed to the documentation. "Read it, all of it. Then make your decision, but make it based on actual facts, not fear that change equals weakness." She left the papers on the table and walked out before anyone could respond. Margaret followed her outside. "That was brave. That was desperate. I don't know if it worked. It worked on me. I've been telling James for weeks that McBride's offer seems too good. Now I have proof." Margaret smiled slightly. "Men like to think they make the hard decisions, but women run the households. We'll see what happens when 6 wives read those documents." Lillian rode back to the main estate with her ribs aching and her hope fragile. She'd done what she could. The rest was up to families choosing their own futures. She found Ethan in his study, covered in mud from the irrigation work, looking exhausted. "How bad is it?" she asked. "We lost half the eastern field water flow. Equipment failure combined with old infrastructure finally giving out. It'll take 2 weeks to repair, minimum." He looked up. "How was your day?" She told him about the Porter meeting, the buyout offers, her attempt to present facts over fear. Ethan listened without interrupting, his expression growing darker. "They're calling me weak. They're scared. McBride's offering certainty. We're offering potential. Fear makes certainty look attractive. Maybe they're right to be scared. Maybe I am weak now. Stop." Lillian moved to his desk, took his muddy hands in hers. "You dove into a flooding river to save me. You confronted the governor with a vision for sustainable development. You're rebuilding an entire territory while learning to be human simultaneously. That's not weak. That's the hardest thing anyone can do."
I don't feel strong. I feel like I'm barely holding everything together. That's what actual strength looks like, not the illusion of control you had before. Real strength, acknowledging fear and acting anyway. He pulled her close, not caring about the mud, just needing contact. What if we fail? What if in 6 months the governor looks at our results and decides McBride was right? Then we fail. Together. And we figure out what comes next. But Ethan, we're not going to fail. Because every day more families are choosing community over extraction. More people are seeing that what we're building actually works. You sound certain. I'm terrified, but I'm choosing to act like I'm certain until reality catches up. He laughed against her hair. That's my line. I learned from the best. They stood there in the muddy study, holding each other like anchors in a storm, until Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway. Mr. and Mrs. Caldwell, you might want to come outside. They found Margaret Porter in the yard along with the 5 other wives from the northern homesteads. Each woman held the documentation Lillian had left, and their expressions were determined. Margaret spoke for all of them. We read McBride's actual plans, showed them to our husbands. 4 families have decided to stay and support Greystone's development. 2 are still considering. And your husband? Lillian asked. Is currently sulking in the barn because I told him I'd divorce him before I'd let him sell our land to a man who'd destroy it in 5 years. Margaret smiled. He'll come around. He always does when I put my foot down. The other women nodded agreement, and Lillian felt something loosen in her chest. This was how it worked. Not dramatic conversions or sudden revelations, but slow, stubborn choices made by people who decided to believe in potential over certainty. Thank you, Ethan said quietly, for taking the time to understand what we're actually building here. We're not doing it for you, Mr. Caldwell, another wife said, Anna Chen. We're doing it for our children. We want them to inherit land that's alive, not stripped dead. We want them to grow up in community, not corporate servitude. That's worth fighting for. After they left, Ethan turned to Lillian. You did that. They did that. I just gave them information. You gave them courage to choose differently. That's your gift. He paused. I'm starting to understand what you saw in this place that I missed. It's not just systems and infrastructure. It's people making daily choices to build something better. I was so focused on managing operations that I couldn't see the actual community growing. You see it now. Because you made me look. The next 4 months were brutal. Summer brought drought that tested their water systems. The eastern field repairs took 3 weeks instead of 2, putting them behind on harvest schedules. 2 families left anyway, taking McBride's buyout despite their wives' protests. A wildfire in the western section destroyed timber resources Ethan had been counting on for winter construction. Every setback felt like proof that their model couldn't work, that efficiency would always beat community, that the governor would look at their results and choose McBride's extraction plan. But other things were happening too. The wells Samuel Roth restored came online ahead of schedule, providing water security that attracted 3 new families to settle in Greystone. The harvest, though delayed, yielded better than expected because farmers were sharing knowledge and resources instead of competing. Daniel Mackenzie organized a volunteer firefighting force that contained the wildfire before it could spread to homesteads. The Collins farm became profitable enough that Robert started helping other struggling farmers implement his techniques. Small victories, incremental progress. Nothing dramatic, but it added up. By October, when the territorial governor sent notice he'd be visiting for final assessment, Greystone had numbers that told a story. 23 families thriving versus 4 that had left. Recovery completion ahead of projected timelines. Water security established for the next decade. Economic growth steady and sustainable. 0 families in crisis requiring emergency intervention. It's good, Ethan said, reviewing their final presentation. But is it enough? It has to be. Governor Harrison arrived on a crisp October morning, bringing the same polite disinterest he'd shown 6 months ago. Ethan and Lillian presented their results. Ethan handling economics, Lillian handling community impact, both demonstrating how integrated their approach had become. Harrison listened, reviewed documentation, asked pointed questions. His expression gave nothing away. Then he asked to tour the territory. They spent 2 days showing him everything: the restored wells, the rebuilt homesteads, the expanded operations. Harrison talked to families, asked about their experiences, probed for weaknesses in the community model. At the Collins farm, he asked Sarah directly, "Are you better off than you were a year ago?" Sarah didn't hesitate. "A year ago, I was scared my children would starve. Now I'm planning which college my oldest might attend." "Yes, Governor, we're better off." At the Mackenzie homestead, Harrison asked Daniel, "How sustainable is your recovery?" Daniel looked at his sober reflection in the well water. 6 months sober, family healthy, farm profitable. "I'd say pretty sustainable, sir, long as I keep choosing it daily." At the trading post, Harrison asked workers about management. "Do you feel the Caldwell's approach is effective?" Thomas Brennan answered, "They're not perfect. They make mistakes. But they actually listen when we tell them something's wrong, and they work to fix it. That's more than I can say for most frontier operations." On the final evening, Harrison requested a private meeting with Ethan and Lillian in their study. "I've seen enough," he said without preamble. "I'm granting you full approval for the eastern expansion. Water rights, development permissions, everything you requested." Lillian felt relief so strong it nearly knocked her down. Ethan's hand found hers, squeezed tight. "Thank you, Governor." "Don't thank me. You earned it." Harrison pulled out papers. "But I'm adding conditions. First, you'll establish a territorial council, representatives from each section meeting quarterly to provide input on policy. Your operation can't just be top-down anymore, even benevolent top-down. It needs to be actually collaborative." "Agreed," Ethan said immediately. "Second, you'll document your model, write it up properly, publish it, make it available to other territories. What you've built here, sustainable community development in harsh conditions, that's replicable. Other places need to see it's possible." "We can do that," Lillian said. "Third," Harrison smiled slightly, "you'll accept a formal territorial designation. Greystone becomes an official community territory instead of private holdings. You'll still manage operations, but with actual legal responsibility to the people, not just ownership of assets." Ethan was quiet, and Lillian knew what he was processing. This was the final letting go, transforming his private empire into actual community governance, giving up the absolute control he'd once valued above everything. "That's acceptable," Ethan said finally. "More than acceptable. It's what this should have been from the beginning." Harrison stood, shook both their hands. 6 months ago, I saw a frontier operation trying to evolve. Today, I see a functioning community. That transformation didn't happen by accident. It happened because you both chose to build something bigger than yourselves." He paused. "The territory is lucky to have you, both of you, working together." After he left, Ethan and Lillian sat in silence, processing what had just happened. They'd won, completely. The eastern expansion, the water rights, everything. But more than that, they'd proven their model worked. That community could survive where extraction would fail. That caring about people wasn't weakness, but foundation. "We did it," Lillian whispered. "We did." "I can't believe we actually did it." Ethan pulled her into his lap, careful of her ribs that had finally healed. "I can. Because you're stubborn and impossible, and you refuse to accept that anything is truly impossible. And you're learning to jump into rivers. I'm learning a lot of things. Slowly. Very slowly. But learning." They kissed, long and deep and full of everything they'd survived to get here. When they broke apart, both slightly breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers. "I love you," he said. "Not because you helped save my territory, not because you made me a better leader, but because you're you, stubborn and brave and completely unreasonable about giving up on things or people you believe in. I love you too, even when you're impossible and stubborn and emotionally constipated." Emotionally constipated? It's an accurate description. I prefer emotionally careful. Sure, let's call it that. The formal announcement happened 3 days later, a gathering of the entire territory at the trading post. Everyone who'd fought to build this community assembled to hear their future confirmed. Ethan stood before them, and Lillian saw him take a breath, steady himself. Public speaking still wasn't natural for him. Vulnerability still cost him. But he was trying. 6 months ago, Governor Harrison gave us a choice, he said. Prove Greystone could sustain itself as a community or accept external development through extraction. Today he granted us full approval. The eastern expansion is ours. The water rights are secured. Greystone's future is in our hands.
Applause, but Ethan raised a hand for silence. But that future isn't mine to control alone anymore. Governor Harrison is requiring, and I'm agreeing, that we establish formal community governance, a territorial council with representatives from each section, real input on policy, not just my decisions handed down. He paused. I built this operation believing control was strength. My wife taught me that partnership is stronger. Now we're extending that partnership to all of you. He looked at Lillian, extended his hand. She joined him, standing beside him before the territory they'd saved together. Mrs. Caldwell will coordinate council formation, Ethan continued, because she actually knows how to build community while I'm still learning. Together, all of us together, we'll make this work. More applause, and this time Lillian spoke. 6 months ago, I dove into a river to save a child. My husband dove in after me. That's what community means, choosing to jump into danger for each other, choosing to believe people are worth saving, choosing to build something that lasts instead of something that just profits. She looked around at faces she'd come to know. Sarah Collins with baby Lillian, Daniel Mackenzie sober and steady, the Hendersons proud of their expansion, families who'd chosen to stay and fight. You all made that choice. Not us, you. We just provided structure for your courage. Pretty speech, someone called. Marcus Webb, standing in the back. But can you sustain it? Can Greystone actually function as community long-term, or does this collapse the moment crisis hits? It wasn't hostile, just honest questioning. Marcus had earned the right to skepticism. I don't know, Lillian said truthfully. We'll probably fail sometimes, make mistakes, hurt people we're trying to help. That's what happens when you try something new. She paused. But I'd rather fail trying to build something real than succeed at exploitation. Wouldn't you? Marcus considered, then nodded. Yeah, I would. Then let's fail together if we have to. But let's try to succeed first. The gathering lasted hours. People celebrating, planning, arguing about council representation and policy details. Lillian watched it all with something like awe. These people were taking ownership of their territory's future, not waiting for Ethan to dictate terms. This was what she'd wanted from the beginning. This was what she'd nearly died for. Late that night, after everyone had left and the territory had settled into sleep, Lillian and Ethan walked through the main settlement together. The October air was cold, but not brutal yet. Winter still a few weeks away. How does it feel? Lillian asked. Giving up control? Terrifying. Liberating. Both simultaneously. He took her hand. I keep waiting to panic, to want to take it back, but mostly I just feel relieved. Relieved? That I'm not responsible for everything alone anymore. That I have you. That we have this... He gestured at the settlement. This community that actually functions. It's not all on me to hold together. It never was. You just convinced yourself it was. I'm good at convincing myself of things that keep me isolated. They walked in comfortable silence, past the trading post, past homesteads showing warm lights in windows, past the well that Samuel Roth had restored and that now fed the entire southern section. Do you ever regret it? Ethan asked quietly. Marrying me? It's been harder than the practical arrangement we agreed to. Every day, Lillian said, then smiled at his expression. I regret that it's hard, that we fight and hurt each other and struggle to understand each other. But I don't regret choosing you, even when you're impossible. I regret making it hard for you. I regret every time I retreated into walls instead of trusting you. I regret... He stopped. I regret a lot, but not marrying you. That might be the only decision I've made that was completely right. It was supposed to be a practical arrangement. Best practical arrangement I ever made. They ended up at their house, no longer just Ethan's fortress, but their actual home. Mrs. Henderson had left lights burning, the study warm, everything ready for them. Upstairs in the room they now shared instead of maintaining separate quarters, they undressed and climbed into bed together. The casual intimacy of it still felt remarkable to Lillian. This man who'd once been so controlled, so distant, now comfortable being close. What happens now? She asked, her head on his chest. We build the council. Develop the eastern expansion. Document our model like Harrison requested. Try to sustain what we've started. That's the practical answer. What's the personal answer? Ethan was quiet, thinking. We keep learning each other. Keep choosing each other, even when it's hard. Keep building this life we're making together. That sounds exhausting. It is, but it's also, he searched for words. It's also the first thing I've done that feels actually important. Not just successful or efficient or profitable. Important. Lillian lifted her head to look at him. You're getting sentimental in your old age. I'm 35, that's not old. Ancient, decrepit, practically dead. You're 27, that makes you an infant. A very wise infant who saved your territory. A very stubborn infant who nearly drowned saving my territory. Details. He pulled her closer, kissed her thoroughly. I love you, my wise, stubborn, occasionally suicidal wife. I love you too. My impossible, emotionally careful, slowly learning to be human husband. Outside, winter was coming to Greystone territory, but they'd survived worse winters. Together, they'd built something that could withstand cold and crisis and all the brutal challenges frontier life threw at them. Not because they were perfect, not because they never failed or fought or hurt each other, but because they kept choosing to try, kept choosing each other, kept choosing to build something real instead of settling for something merely practical. 2 years later, the Greystone Community Territory published its sustainability model in territorial records. The documentation showed measurable success, population growth, economic stability, crisis management protocols that other territories started adopting. But the real story wasn't in statistics. It was in Sarah Collins teaching at the new schoolhouse, her daughter Lillian in the front row, in Daniel Mackenzie celebrating 2 years sober, his farm thriving. In the Territorial Council meeting quarterly, voices from every section contributing to governance, and families who'd chosen to stay building something that would outlast them. It was in Ethan Caldwell learning to smile more easily, to listen more fully, to lead with partnership instead of dominance. It was in Lillian Caldwell standing before the governor's regional assembly, presenting Greystone's model to other territories, proving that community could survive where exploitation failed. But mostly it was in small moments nobody documented. Ethan teaching their daughter, born in the 3rd year, named Margaret after Lillian's mother, how to read survey maps while Lillian taught her how to listen to people's stories. Lillian pulling Ethan away from work to watch sunset over the eastern expansion, land they'd fought for now, feeding 3 times the families it had before. Both of them sitting in their study late at night, arguing about council policy and water rights, and whether they were raising their daughter to be too stubborn, while outside the territory they'd saved together slept secure. The marriage that had started as a calculated arrangement for property rights had become something neither of them had planned for or known how to build. It was messy, imperfect, still required daily work and choice. But it was real. Completely, beautifully, frustratingly real. And in the harsh environment of Greystone territory, where survival was never guaranteed and easy answers didn't exist, that realness mattered more than any careful plan or efficient system ever could. Because in the end, the strongest structures weren't the ones built from control and calculation. They were the ones built from choice and courage and the stubborn, improbable decision to keep trying, to keep jumping into rivers literal and metaphorical, even when the water was cold and the current was strong and the outcome was never certain. Ethan and Lillian Caldwell had learned that lesson the hard way, but they'd learned it together, and that made all the difference. On winter evenings, when the territory gathered at the trading post and stories were told, people talked about the Caldwells with something like reverence, not because they were perfect leaders or flawless visionaries, but because they'd been willing to change, to admit mistakes, to build something better than what they'd started with. Remember when Mr. Caldwell ran everything like a military operation? Someone would say. Remember when Mrs. Caldwell dove into that flood? Remember when they almost gave up on each other? Remember when they decided to try anyway? The stories would continue, some exaggerated, some simplified, all containing the essential truth of what had happened in Greystone. 2 imperfect people had chosen each other, chosen community over efficiency, chosen to jump into rivers even when drowning seemed certain, and somehow, against all reasonable odds, they'd survived, more than survived. They'd built something that lasted, something real, something worth fighting for. And in the brutal, beautiful, unforgiving landscape of frontier territory, where winter killed the unprepared and hardship separated the determined from the desperate, that was the greatest victory possible. Not perfection, not ease, just the stubborn, daily choice to keep building, keep trying, Keep loving even when it was hard. Keep jumping into rivers. Together. Always together.